supported and how their conditions should be appropriately met. But the overall decision about the final judgment on the clinical provision is a matter for the clinicians themselves.
Thank you. The next item of business is a debate on motion number 8857 in the name of Richard Lochhead on the Common Agricultural Policy. Members who wish to take part in the debate should press the request to speak button now, and I'll give a few seconds for the front benches to change position.
Good afternoon, and I'd invite members who wish to speak in this debate to press the request to speak buttons now or as soon as possible. And I call on Mr Richard Lochhead to speak to and move the motion. Cabinet Secretary of 14 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and of course it's appropriate to have a farmer in the chair for this particular debate. This morning, the Government published interim figures for the total income from farming in Scotland for 2013. And as the Chamber may be aware, total income went up by £128 million, albeit the picture, of course, does vary between sectors, and in some respects it's a bounce back from a very difficult year last year. But the figures do confirm the importance of the Common Agricultural Policy for farmers and crofters. Out of a total net income of £828.6 million, £561.9 million came from grants and European support. So this debate isn't a topic of great importance for the sector. In 2011, the European Commission published its proposals. Following on from the McSharry and Fischler reforms, these proposals represented the biggest changes to the CAP in a decade, and Europe's first ever attempt to redistribute the CAP payments to base them on fairness and not history. The Commission said that the new CAP must be, and I quote, greener, fairer, more efficient, more effective, and moving away from income support and market measures and focusing on environmental and climate change objectives. So Europe wanted farms to become greener and more market-focused, supported with the agricultural payments, but not driven by them. Here in Scotland, the Government, of course, supported, as did many people in this chamber, the general thrust of these reforms, and Brian Pack's inquiry confirmed that the CAP must deliver clearer benefits for the public purse. But we also insisted that Europe does not lose sight of the policy's primary purpose to support viable food production. We had specific negotiating objectives on slipper farming, couple support, new entrants and so on. So it's worth reminding ourselves how the Scottish Government objectives differed from the UK Government's. The fear that the UK might massively cut the CAP budget did of course evaporate, thankfully, but even so the UK still wanted a substantial reduction in CAP spending, especially Pillar 1, which is the direct payments to Scottish farms. They wanted to abolish couple support and phase out these Pillar 1 payments completely. Now, the EU negotiations finished last autumn. As always, the final compromise was far from perfect, but Scotland did score some negotiating successes. Firstly, we secured the Scottish clause to combat slipper farming. We also ensured that new entrants can be treated fairly under the new policy, and we changed the details of greening so that it fits better with real farming practices. And we fought off the risk that heather, for instance, would be ineligible whether or not it's genuinely farmed, and we ensured the timetable for changing the less favoured area system was realistic, and we secured more flexibility and removed the worst of the bureaucracy in the original proposals. However, I think I speak again for many people in Scotland when I say alongside these successes there were, of course, some disappointments. For example, couple support is the only remaining tool in Pillar 1 for directly supporting production. But Scotland is limited to 8% of that couple support, when other member states can have 13%.
Ferguson.
I appreciate him doing so. Would he concede that the UK Government was totally opposed to coupled support at all and did in fact negotiate the position due to the influence of the Scottish input?
Secretary.
Well, I hope we did influence the UK Government in that. I think the fundamental point is to bear in mind we did have a situation where the UK Government did want zero coupled support, which, given the disproportionate importance of the livestock sector in Scotland, would have indeed been grave news for our economy and our sectors. So we've got 8% just now, and other countries are getting 13%, but the UK Government does, of course, still say it's generously prepared to discuss letting us go a bit higher. And, of course, that offer is hedged around with conditions. but it does remind us that they did fail to negotiate what Scotland needed in the first place, just as they did on the budget as well. We entered the negotiations with the worst budget deal in the whole of Europe on Pillar 2, rural development, and the third worst settlement on Pillar 1 in the whole of Europe. The UK had the opportunity to get us a fairer deal, but of course they didn't even lift a finger to try and do that. And to add insult to injury, when dividing the budget within the UK, they took the so-called convergence money that Europe intended for Scotland and spread it over the whole of the UK sectors, leaving us with now the worst per hectare budgets in Europe for both pillars, direct payments and rural development budgets. Of course, I've said, and I'll say it again, had we been an independent country, we would have got an extra €1 billion under that formula for Pillar 1 alone, which would have generated, we estimate, 2,500 new jobs in Scotland. And, of course, we'd have been able to negotiate a better deal under Pillar 2, the rural development budgets, where, ironically, it's actually easier in some respects to target support on active farmers than it is in Pillar 1. So faced with a pretty difficult situation, indeed impossible situation, I had to take a decision in December on transferring funds between these two pillars. But our Pillar 2 budget, of course, was so poor that without a transfer we would have been unable to meet our rural development commitments, like meeting their legal requirements on the environment and protecting the LFAS payments, which alone account for about a third of the Pillar 2 budget. So after taking stakeholders' views, I decided limiting the transfer to 9.5% would strike the right balance, limiting the impact, of course, on Pillar 1, whilst allowing a reasonable Pillar 2 programme. Even with the transfer, our budget for the SRDP, the Rural Development Programme, is extremely low, which requires tough decisions about prioritisation within that programme. So I do continue to look at envy with other member states who are deciding how to spend their increases in their budgets, whilst here in Scotland we're debating how to deal with their decreases. And of course, I'd love to be like Ireland, able to fund a big beef sector improvement programme from their Pillar 2 fund, given their large budgets. But Scotland's budget is tiny in comparison with so many other countries. But my proposals for the Rural Development Programme will protect LFAS payments and increase agri-environment schemes by over £10 million a year. But of course, we're having to squeeze the budgets in other areas. In particular, farm capital grants will have to be a lot more focused on new entrants, for instance. Now, these proposals are set out in the Scottish Government consultation, which was published in December, and we have a separate consultation on Pillar 1, the direct payments, which finishes in mid-March. And to complement the consultation exercises, I will be writing shortly to all farmers in Scotland who receive payments about the remaining time of the consultation, to remind them, if they can, to submit their views. Yeah.
Liam MacArthur.
Very grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for taking an intervention. In relation to the consultation that he's referred to, we are aware that in my own constituency, Orkney, where agriculture is exceptionally important but also quite intensive, there are specific issues. I've received a briefing from the local NFU suggesting that one of the Outer Isles, Westray, which is particularly dependent on agriculture, could be set to lose something around £330,000 as a result of this. I know he's sceptical about using the ANC under Pillar 1, but has he had time to reflect on what sorts of interventions might be possible to try and compensate or redress that particular problem?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thanks. I do recognise the specific issues in islands, and I'll come to some of the wider issues that are similar to the situation in Liam MacArthur's constituency. But of course, that's one reason why we were very keen to protect the LFAS payments, which account for a third of the Pillar 2 budget, which will benefit Mr MacArthur's constituents. But of course, the consultation at the moment is generating a lot of interest, as members are already indicating. And clearly the Government won't take decisions until these consultations are over. But it's very clear there are some key themes that are emerging. One is, of course, on slipper farming. We did work hard to ensure the new CAP would end slipper farming, and were pleased when the so-called Scottish clause was included in the CAP regulations. It's fair to say, however, we are disappointed with the Commission's first draft of the implementation rules, because it didn't accommodate the Scottish clause in the way that we envisaged. If this rendered the clause toothless, then payments to slipper farmers would of course continue, and everyone else's payments would be diluted. However, I am pleased to say that we do think there's a way forward here, and the Government believes that such fears are unfounded. And we have proposals that we now want to discuss with the industry, and we're meeting the stakeholders on this subject and others next week. Another emerging issue, of course, is greening. We must deliver more environmental benefit from the policy, but the risk of red tape is very, very high, so getting the right balance right, of course, again, will be crucial. And concerns are also being expressed about the impact on beef producers, in particular in Scotland, some of whom fear a reduction in their payments, and in some cases massive reductions. I very much understand their concerns and, of course, greatly sympathise with the reductions they are facing, particularly those who are genuinely still active beef producers who face significant reductions in their payments. That's a crucial area of the new policy. It's important that, however, that we do understand some of the details. First, some people are implying that the impact on beef farmers' payments is entirely due to Scotland's plans for regionalisation and transition. And of course, that's not the case. There's a general downward pressure on the basic payments budgets. Everyone's payments are going to be smaller than they would have been if Scotland had got a fairer budget deal. Plus, there are mandatory reductions imposed by Europe, so some reduction is inevitable for many producers. And secondly, some people think that the deal breaks a link between activity and payments levels. Well, of course, we have to remember the link between the size of a farmer's payments and the size of his herd or flock was broken back in the 2003 reform. And of course, I do recognise that is a contradiction in EU policy. Europe wants to support food production, as we do here in Scotland, but of course, for a decade, it's operated a policy that limits our ability as countries to actually do that when it comes to issuing the payments. And it's not a very logical position whatsoever for Europe to adopt. But we are where we are, and Europe's not going to shift its direction of travel. So it's true that some farmers who are highly active and have been getting high payments may see their payments go down, and significantly in some cases as we move from a historic to area basis of payments. And I understand why some people, for instance, are attracted to an alternative to what's in the consultation document, the so-called tunnel approach, which maintains historic-based elements from the single farm payment moving forward. And I know the Farmers' Union sees potential merit in that option. But when considering the options, we have to be very, very careful. There is a dilemma here. Using the tunnel, farms would get payments in 2019 or 2020 based on their activity back in 2000. It would protect payments to farmers who used to be very active, but now who are not that active. And in one example, a farmer contacted me to say that his payments were going to be halved, but when we checked his actual activity over the period of this current policy, his activity levels have also halved as well. Now, the tunnel approach could also prolong the disadvantage suffered by new entrants. And new entrants who started in, say, the year 2000, aged 35, would not be in a full level playing field till 2025 perhaps, by which time he'd be 60 years of age. Now, some people say that the government's approach would move Scottish farmers more quickly to an area-based payments than would also be the case in other countries. That's another argument being made, which I'm listening to. Again, 15 years will have actually passed between the decoupling of heritage payments and full area-based payments. 15 years. So the tunnel option is there, it has its attractions, but of course we have to go in with our eyes open and recognise there are very serious downsides as well. Of course, I do understand, however, the real concerns that are being expressed by many sectors in the industry. But we must not let our farm sector tear itself apart over this reform. Every group has the right to argue for its own interests, of course it does, and I will listen to each and every individual case. But we have to focus on overall solutions, what's best for Scottish agriculture as a whole, and look at that very, very closely. I want to avoid partial solutions that pit farmer against farmer, young against old, beef against arable, hill against lowland. So that's really what lies behind the government's proposals we have on the table at the moment, the big picture. We do believe our transition plans give established businesses time to adjust, give new entrants fair treatment and get the whole sector onto a level playing field by 2020. Our activity rules will ensure no payments go to land where there is no activity or just token activity, leaving more investment to spread over the real farming community in Scotland. And we will target the beef sector with coupled support. And of course, modelling shows the impact of reform is complex as well. Overall, over 50% of farmers would get higher payments under the new policy and only 47% would get lower. Although I say only 47%, of course, that's a substantial number of farmers in Scotland. And even within the beef sector, over 40% would receive increased payments. Although I recognise those perhaps most productive beef farmers are actually the ones that receive the big reductions, and that is an issue. So we do acknowledge the impact specifically on the beef sector, and again, that's why we have said we'll use the maximum couple support available for the beef sector, unless we are persuaded differently by the consultation exercise. We've also set up a group under Jim McLaren of Quality Meat Scotland to look at the beef sector and its future. The final point I just want to make before closing is some people have said that our approach to the reform is guided by keeping the deliverability of the policy simple and easy. Well, that's not what's guiding our approach to this reform process. We're doing what's best for Scottish agriculture, food production and our wider rural economy. But it is a factor. The more complex we make the solutions to some of the issues that have been brought to our attention, the more difficult it will be to deliver the policy in Scotland. And we don't want to go through the experience that other countries have had, where they've simply been unable to make the payments because the lack of preparation or the system is just simply so complex. And of course, because we have diverse farming systems in Scotland, that is a temptation to have a really diverse, complex policy. But of course, that will only lead to bigger problems in the future. Then we'll all regret that we chose these particular solutions. We have to be very careful and try and strike that right balance. So in closing, Presiding Officer, I just want to say that we will look at the responses to the consultation exercises very, very carefully and closely. We'll continue our very close and tense work with the stakeholders in the coming weeks and months. And of course, the purpose of today's debate is to hear the views at this stage in the consultation process. There will be more opportunities in the future of each political party and MSPs who represent our farming sectors. And I very much look forward to hearing all your views today as we collectively, hopefully, try and get the best solution for Scottish agriculture through the new CAP reform process. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call on Claire Baker to speak to and move Amendment 8857.2. Ms Baker, 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As we all recognise, farming plays an important role in Scotland's economy, society and well-being. Our agricultural sector not only produces food for our country and beyond, but also contributes to the vitality of our rural communities. CAP reform is the opportunity we have before us to make sure the support, which is public money, is directed to areas where it delivers the widest public benefit. And as the Scottish Government come to decisions about how the resources are allocated in Scotland, this must be at the centre of their deliberations. When we consider some of the current subsidies, subsidy being given to land which has not actively been used, highly profitable businesses receiving significant sums of public money, while others receive no or very little support, when it could be argued they are providing as much, if not greater, community and social benefit, or new entrants who are being excluded from support when they are the future of the sector. This is our opportunity to deliver a fairer system that is clear about what it values. Of course, this is not easy. A good case can always be made for why a business or an organisation should receive subsidy and what the potential impact of any changes to their subsidy will be. But choices will have to be made, and if we remember that this is public investment and we are facing significant challenges in the viability of some rural communities, in tackling food poverty and in achieving our environmental targets in climate, water and biodiversity, we do need meaningful reform. Turning to Labour's amendment, during the last debate on the Common Agricultural Policy, this chamber was united on the issue of convergence uplift. And as one of the 4 signatories of the cross-party letter to Owen Patterson, I won't defend the decision of the coalition government. It was the wrong decision. I cannot, however, take the view of the Cabinet Secretary that separation is the answer, and until then any attempt of holding a review within the UK is futile. Within the EU, Scotland has a low per hectare average. If payments are calculated by different measures, such as per farm unit or per employee, Scotland compares far better. However, per hectare is the accepted chosen measurement, and Scotland's calculation is the reason for the UK's additional support. And we all agreed during the last CAP debate that the UK Government should recognise the challenge of Scotland's distinct and diverse agricultural needs and transfer the full convergence uplift to Scotland. That they did not was a great disappointment, not just to everybody here in the chamber, but to farmers and rural communities across the country that will miss out. However, as we enter today's debate, looking back at that decision and using it to further political agendas, particularly around the Constitution, would be a mistake. We owe it to our rural communities to look forward and have an open and frank discussion on not just how we implement this CAP, but also start to take a longer-term approach. It's for that reason that we shouldn't be dismissive of any potential review proposed by the UK Government. NFU Scotland has a written commitment from Owen Patterson to hold a review of the internal allocation of CAP funds, which will be concluded by 2017. This review will not change the current budget, and that is regrettable, but perhaps understandable given the changes in funding arrangements that may have to take place at its conclusion. I think the Cabinet Secretary is mistaken to simply dismiss the review. He may be sceptical that such a review will take place, and certain farmers might be too, but we cannot put our agricultural sector on pause and hope that it all works and sorts itself out. The Government must start working towards a review, completing the move from historic to area payments and holding the UK Government to undertake their promised review. This shouldn't be a political football to be used during a debate on the Constitution. but it is about the future of the livelihoods of farmers and rural communities across the length and breadth of Scotland. The onus is now on the Government in Scotland to make the change from historic to area-based payments. The current consultation on direct payments takes a significant step forward, and this is to be welcomed. Movement from historic to briefly.
Stuart Stevenson.
The member is focusing on the move from historic to area-based payments, and I understand why she does that. But is she also cognizant of the need to support production?
Yeah, Baker.
The member makes a point that I'm sure will be focused on during the debate, the importance of activity, and I will move on to make some comments on that. Movement from historic to area-based can deliver a fairer distribution between large farms, who are often our most economically viable of farms, and those that are in need of subsidies to survive and contribute to their local economy. To have a thriving farming sector in Scotland, we must ensure a varied farming sector, including smaller farms and high nature value farming. And we need appropriate timescales for this to happen. I was pleased to hear the Cabinet Secretary's comments around the Irish Tunnel model, which I believe would result in entitlements from historic funding still being retained decades after the allocation was initially announced, and this isn't acceptable. The Scottish Government have argued for convergence across the EU and the UK. We now need to see those principles applied to the distribution of funds within Scotland. I welcome the consultation which is taking place, but the Cabinet Secretary needs to ensure he hears a broad range of views. NFU Scotland will have legitimate concerns about how changes are implemented, but there is an appetite for redistribution to areas which need the support most and is evidence to give the greatest public benefit. In terms of payment regions, we need something that is as simple as possible, but also something that is fair. Guarding too much against maps being too complex runs the risk of them simply being too simplistic and possibly less effective. We have the opportunity to address the issue of slipper farmers, which have too long been a negative aspect of cap payment. It is vital that this practice is ended as soon as possible and all appropriate action is taken to ensure that there are no further loopholes that can be exploited. It is important that all cap payments are as transparent and accountable as is possible. But this is not just about farming businesses and food production. Agriculture is one of Scotland's biggest sectors for emissions, and in 2011, agricultural and rural land use accounted for 20% of Scotland's total emissions. There is more the agricultural sector can do to contribute towards meeting our climate change targets, along with our biodiversity targets, and we must see a stronger move towards sustainable farming. This will benefit not just our farmers, but also our rural communities and the wider population. CAP was supposed to deliver for the environment, but so far I think there's agreement that this has been disappointing. Greening has been the key policy designed to deliver this, and we do have opportunities now to maximise what it can deliver. There is the prospect of equivalent practices for meeting greening targets, which could lead potentially to practices being used that suit the needs and priorities of Scotland. Can the Cabinet Secretary indicate which of the equivalent practices he believes would best achieve these priorities, and if he is minded to allow greening measures to be reached through the 3 standard greening measures or through equivalent practices? We do need to see greater environmental effort. Some may point to the greening aspect of Pillar 1, which is to be welcomed, but as arable farming makes up only 18% of our agricultural area, it is clear that the benefits from greening will be limited. So transfer between Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 is important. While NFU Scotland called for 5%, Scottish Environment Link and others called for the full 15%. The advantages of a boosted Pillar 2 are clear, and I do appreciate the Cabinet Secretary was being pulled in 2 directions, but there are benefits for the farming sector in a boosted Pillar 2, as Pillar 2 funding largely stays within the agricultural sector, but the money is much more targeted and more objective focused. Also, the LEADER programme for rural communities gets such a small share of the funds, yet can deliver so much in terms of community sustainability and provides clear public benefit. We should be able to see more support in this area. It was disappointing to see the Government decide on a 9.5 transfer between Pillar 1 and 2, compared to 12% in England and 15% in Wales. Considering the Government's commitment to climate change and biodiversity targets and delivering sustainable development to rural communities, I was disappointed that we didn't go beyond 9.5%. How will the Cabinet Secretary use, and is he minded to use, degressivity and capping to ensure we can see further funds going into Pillar 2. As stated within the consultation, this could be anything upwards of €1 million per year and potentially between €1 million per year and potentially between €5 and €10 million per year. So it would be interesting to hear the Cabinet Secretary's further comments on this area. When it comes to spending on agri-environment schemes, we languish close to the bottom, spending only €39.9 per hectare compared to the EU 27 average of €235. Whilst this is due in part to the overall amount Scotland receives from the UK, Scotland's slower response to the programme to actually be engaged in this agenda, it is also due to decisions taken by the Scottish Government on how to cut the cake. Comparable countries such as Ireland, Slovenia and Finland, who also have large areas of low-intensity land, spend significantly higher amounts on agri-environment schemes while also spending similar amounts on less favoured areas. The Cabinet Secretary does have difficult decisions to make, and in finding the right balance, it won't be possible to please everyone. But this is an opportunity. I want to see reform. I don't want us to end up in a status quo situation, and we must set realistic timescales that prioritise the benefits that can come from change. I move the amendment in my name.
Many thanks. I now call on Alex Ferguson to speak to and move Amendment 8857.1. Mr Ferguson, 6 minutes or thereby, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This is a debate in which I wish it were possible for Parliament to speak with one voice. We have often managed to do so on this topic in the past, but I regret it seems unlikely that that will be the case at decision time this evening. I think that's not a great shame. I think it's also a missed opportunity on the part of the Government, as there is a lot in this debate around which I genuinely believe we could have all agreed. Surely even this Government would agree that a unanimous vote from this Parliament would carry a much stronger message to both the UK Government and the EU than the fragmented result that I fear we are likely to see this afternoon. Those are the exact same words with which I began the last CAP debate on the 2nd of October, Presiding Officer, and I'm sorry to say that there seems very little reason at all, if any, to change them, given that the Scottish Government's position, certainly in the public domain since then, appears to have been to simply try to whip up more and more enmity towards the UK Government by the use of the somewhat vitriolic language that it has been employing. Yes, of course I will, if time.
I'm grateful to the member for taking intervention. I hear what he says, but would he accept that when we did show unanimity in this Parliament about the convergence uplift, the UK Government ignored us?
Which is not a reason in my book to discontinue the unanimity of this Parliament. End of story. What I do agree with, I think we all agree with, and I absolutely know that farmers agree with, is that we would all have preferred to have seen an increased budget with which the Scottish Government could implement the reformed CAP support system. Of course we would. It should go without saying. But we haven't. End of story. And it's time, I believe, to put the lid on the divisive rhetoric that only diverts attention away from the real issues and start to concentrate on the very real concerns that are troubling Scotland's farmers increasingly as they face the uncertainties that are beginning to haunt them over the impact of these reforms. I met with a group of influential farmers in my constituency on Monday. I say influential because they all play a major part in the activities of the NFUS at both local and national level. And they made it quite clear that they are fed up with the political argy-bargy that's been dominating this debate, and they simply want to be able to start planning their futures. It's impossible not to sympathise with them. We sit and stand here, we argue the toss about the political and indeed, I think too often now, the constitutional aspects of this. But their feelings are vividly summed up by one quite emotive email that was sent to the Cabinet Secretary and copied to myself by a constituent of mine last week, and it reads as follows. I farm 28 hectares of permanent grass and 375 hectares of rough grazing, with a stocking rate of 0.3 livestock units per hectare. Under the present proposals for Pillar 1, my SFP will drop by £21,000, and that is from a last year's payment of £34,000. If that amount of money is taken out of my business, I will obviously not have a viable business. How is this fair? Now, that question, how is this fair, lies at the heart of the dilemma that the Cabinet Secretary faces in delivering a CAP that is tailor-made for Scotland, an ability, I note, that was negotiated for him by the UK Government. It is also a question that lies at the heart of NFUS's President, Nigel Miller, in his letter to the Cabinet Secretary on Monday, which promotes a four-pronged package that he believes would result in a fairer transition to area-based payments. And while I don't agree with all of his letter, I have considerable sympathy with much of it. Now, principally, as my amendment suggests, I am very concerned at rumours that the Scottish Government is edging towards a two-payment region system for Scotland. All the evidence would point towards having more regions rather than less, because it's probably fairly obvious that the more regions there are, the more targeted payments could be. However, as the Cabinet Secretary did say, I accept that the number of regions has to be limited by the practicalities of implementation. So I am drawn to the NFUS's argument that there simply has to be an alternative to the single payment approach across the rough grazing region. This is what is causing much of the problem. This is what is so diluting the pot of CAP funding. And this is where the lack of fairness is most obvious. Now, it's good news that the so-called Scottish clause might not be as toothless as we first thought it was going to be, but we still don't know what level of activity will trigger access to CAP support. I fear it may not be high enough, so other measures will have to be pursued. NFUS has put forward possible solutions that are surely worthy of further consideration, but it cannot be beyond the capability of the army of civil servants at the government's disposal to devise a system that will not reward. I don't think I have time, unless you can make allowances, Presiding Officer.
I'll make allowances.
Briefly, Mr. Stevenson.
The Bank of Scotland survey yesterday suggested that farmers are essentially looking for 3 areas. What number does the member think there should be?
I would be content with 3, with a proviso. Because I think it's important. It cannot be impossible to devise a system that does not reward 100 hectares of rock in the northwest of Scotland that produces little other than admittedly stunning scenery, with the same level of financial support as 100 hectares of hill in the south of Scotland that might well support a flock of 100 ewes, preferably blackfaces. And I hope the Cabinet Secretary was correct to stress that this will not be the case, because if this problem can be solved, many of the other concerns can be addressed, at least in part. One possible solution lies in increasing the percentage of the budget we could use for coupled payments, as the Cabinet Secretary mentioned, above and beyond the agreed 8%. Now, I'm not aware of any moves the Cabinet Secretary has made to take up the UK Government's offer of talks to utilise unused UK coupling capacity to increase the percentage at his disposal, but if he does so, he will certainly have our active support. Maybe he could address that in summing up. I have to say, Claire Baker touched on this, I'm also disappointed the Cabinet Secretary continues to glibly dismiss the Secretary of State's proposed review of allocations, which is to report by 2017. I would repeat, I think there's an opportunity we should grasp, and it is, I believe, that we could implement its recommendations in mid-term rather than wait until 2020. I'm aware of time, Presiding Officer, so I will close by saying that the 2 consultations that were somewhat belatedly launched are now in midstream, and I think that slightly begs the question of why we're having this debate now. I've no doubt there will be a further debate post-consultation when we can hopefully concentrate less on the rhetoric and more on the delivery of a meaningful and fair cap support system for Scottish farmers. That is the Cabinet Secretary's challenge. I don't envy him it for the decisions he has to take, but take them he must. The future of Scottish agriculture rests on his shoulders. We cannot support Labour's amendment because I think the Cabinet Secretary was right to hold the amount of transfer from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2 at 9.5%, and I move the amendment in my name.
Many thanks. And we now move to open debate. I call on Graham Day to be followed by Cara Hilton. Speeches of 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. For speakers to come, there's little worse on afternoons such as these when the person who kicks off the open debate tries to cover every aspect of the subject under consideration. In the case of the Common Agricultural Policy, that would of course be impossible, and colleagues may be relieved to learn I won't even attempt it. Instead, I want to focus my contribution on just a couple of aspects of the CAP. Presiding Officer, the NFUS, as any representative body should, are lobbying hard on behalf of their members. There's nothing wrong with that. There would be something wrong if they were not. And to be fair to the NFUS, they are advancing some seemingly reasonable arguments, and to some degree at least indicating a recognition of the realities of the situation Scotland finds itself in. As Nigel Miller acknowledged in the Courier newspaper last week, and I quote, "The move to area payments was never going to be easy for Scotland with a limited budget and a variable jigsaw of land types and farm systems. Area payment systems will always move support away from units where historic production has been intense." And even in extolling the virtues of the northern and in particular southern Irish farming approaches as an alternative to what's been put forward here, Mr Miller accepted that, of course, they have budgets that are more than double that of Scotland. The concerns articulated by the NFUS about the possible implications of funding the vulnerable beef and sheep sectors are not to be dismissed lightly, although it was intriguing to note the apparent disconnect contained within the newly released annual Bank of Scotland survey showing 51% of respondents expressing the view that they anticipate being worse off under the CAP reform, yet a third of beef farmers and 29% of sheep farmers are planning to increase the size of their herds. As Ewan Pate, the farming editor of the Courier, observed today, this does appear to show a massive contradiction between what farmers think privately and what they are saying in public. And of course, the shaping of the CAP arrangements here in Scotland is still a work in progress. We're not at the end game yet, as the Cabinet Secretary made clear earlier. But I have to say I have something of a difficulty with the NFUS position when they talk of minimising modulation, utilising Pillar 2 to top up funding of the beef cow coupled support, and, as they've done on a couple of occasions in front of the Rural Affairs Committee, come up with other agriculture-inclined spends which would further test the elasticity of Pillar 2. Jonathan Hall, the Director of Policy and Regions, has called for the establishment of an advisory service for Scottish agriculture farmers and crofters. We've also had Andrew Bauer of the NFUS suggesting we need knowledge transfer and financial incentives to bring about widespread use of better farming practices in response to the impact of climate change. Now, both may well be worthy proposals, but for me, underlying them is this belief on the part of the NFUS that, if not entirely, then certainly largely, CAP funding belongs to the farming sector. Indeed, in the article I referred to earlier, Mr Miller admitted he was looking for investment in infrastructure and innovation, amongst other things, even if that meant scaling down forestry targets. Well, the Cabinet Secretary has to strike a responsible balance. He cannot simply grant every item on agriculture's CAP wish list, not placed in the financial constraints that he is. The Cabinet Secretary needs to match the competing demands of land use for food production with protecting valuable habitats, and internally within the industry address the interests of key sectors, including less favoured areas, whilst mitigating the impact on other parts of the industry, and balance the needs of allowing farmers to adjust to the changes with providing a fair deal for new entrants as quickly as he can. And the NFUS must surely understand the challenge of striking a balance, for they have members who will be winners and members who will be losers under the new CAP, however it pans out. Pillar 2 has to cater for a wide range of interests and needs across our rural areas. This Scottish Government has to find a way to build on the success story that is Scottish food and drink, while also protecting the natural environment, not least of all from the impacts of climate change, whilst all the time held back by any judgment a poor financial settlement. And let's look at the balance intended to be struck under the Government's provisional, albeit draft, proposals for the new SRDP, with a likely budget of circa £1.35 billion between 2014 and 2020. £459 million for less favoured area support and areas of natural constraint, with further funding for food and drink, crofting grants, grants for small farmers, new entrant support. Totalling all told, I calculate, around £570 million, or 43% of the entire Pillar 2 budget allocation. And that's without even considering the degree of access to the £365 million earmarked for agri-environment and climate change, which the sector also has. But what would they have us cut to ensure a bigger funding pot for agriculture? Well, we know tree planting is considered expendable. Nigel Miller has told us that, regardless of how it might impact upon the environment. But what else? Eat into the £66 million for Leader, which has served rural communities so well, the £20 million to support small rural businesses, which help our young people stay in their rural communities, or the £9 million for broadband infrastructure in our rural parts. Presiding Officer, I'm anything but anti-agriculture. I represent an area rich in farming, but Angus and wider rural Scotland also needs and has enjoyed the support of Pillar 2 in other ways over recent years, and we need to continue managing these often competing pressures. Of course, we really ought to be better placed financially, even if Alec Ferguson and Claire Baker would rather we drew a line under the issue. We could and should have had another €230 million from the convergence uplift. But of course, Owen Patterson said no. An example of what better together means? Well, actually, yes, it is. Mr Patterson could have looked at the Estonians, the Latvians and the Romanians and thought, we can't have part of the UK lagging behind these countries when it comes to Pillar 1 hectare averages, and done something about it. But he didn't. He doesn't believe in direct payments, and in any case it would have been a bit awkward arguing for a fair deal for Scotland when we're the poor relation within the UK as well as broader Europe. And on Pillar 2, he says he's an enthusiast for the benefits that Pillar 2 scheme brings, yet he stands by while 16 other countries secure an uplift in their payments, leaving Scotland to prop up the league table. And even when a pot of money comes the UK's way, purely because Scotland is so poorly treated, he tells us it belongs to all of us in the UK, every part of it. That is a disgrace. And unlike the unionists in this Parliament and their better together buddy, Mr Patterson, those of us in these benches will stand up for Scotland and its interests and argue the undeniable case for independence and the benefits of full member status within the EU. It can be better than better together are offering. All it takes is for Scotland on September the 18th to replace Owen Patterson's no with a simple yes.
Many thanks. Today we are very short of time, so I would be grateful if members could adhere to their allocated time up to 6 minutes. For open debate speakers, Cara Hilton to be followed by Maureen Watt.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and mine is definitely shorter than 6 minutes, I can assure you. I welcome the opportunity to speak in the debate in support of the amendment in the name of Claire Baker. This is an issue that will impact many of our rural communities and is of great importance to the farming industry here in Scotland. European politics can seem very remote from our daily lives, and when you look at some of the complex language in the debate about the Common Agricultural Policy, then it's no surprise that people are turned off. Yet getting CAP reform right is absolutely vital and it's long overdue. It offers us the opportunity to put Scottish agriculture on a more sustainable and more progressive footing and to adapt to meet the many inevitable changes ahead. The Scottish Government has got the power to secure a good and fair deal for Scottish farmers, and I welcome the consultation that's been launched on how direct CAP payments should be implemented in Scotland. On the issue of slipper farming, as Claire's already mentioned, it's absolutely vital that this practice is ended and that CAP funding goes where it's needed most, ensuring that CAP support goes to genuinely active farming businesses. There's a world of difference between land that can be grazed and land that is grazed, and this needs to be recognised and reflected in how direct payments are made. As the National Farmers Union pointed out in the briefing that they circulated yesterday, Scotland cannot afford to drain its limited budget to empty hillsides, and I therefore welcome the Minister's assurance that he is working with stakeholders to address this issue. It's vital that the limited funds that are available are targeted at the most productive land. However, how we measure a productive farm does vary, and it's not as simple as measuring the density of the stock. The Scottish Government has got to take account too of the varied nature of farming within Scotland and look at funding that supports both sustainable farming practices but also ensuring that remote, fragile farms are supported too. And it's also vital that the Scottish Government reaches a decision on the new payment scheme as soon as possible, a payment scheme that ensures that funds are divided on as fair and equitable basis as they can be. We recently debated the Scottish Government's draft climate change adaptation programme, and CAP reform offers significant opportunities to advance our climate change objectives. The proposals allow for a transfer of up to 15% from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2 into rural development funds. Yet the Scottish Government has proposed to transfer just 9.5% to rural development funds. This falls far short of the 15% agreed to by the Welsh Government and called for by environmental campaigners, and below the 12% agreed by the UK Government. And given our failure to achieve our climate change targets in each of the last 2 years, I think it's a shame that the Scottish Government are not grasping this opportunity to be a bit bolder. We now have the opportunity to use CAP funds to support farming practices that protect and restore our natural environment and support our rural communities and our landscapes, an opportunity to make Scotland's farms more sustainable and more environmentally friendly. And this must be a priority if we are to create the right conditions to sustain long-term agricultural production in Scotland. Ultimately, CAP reform is about delivering better value for farmers, taxpayers, consumers and the environment. And while all of us would like to see Scotland secure a better share of CAP funding from the UK Government, we are where we are, as the Minister said already, and we need to work now to ensure that the funds that Scotland does have are targeted as effectively and fairly as possible, ensuring a sustainable long-term future for our rural communities, for our farmers and for our environment.
Many thanks. Now call on Maureen Watt to be followed by Roderick Campbell. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This debate has already proved lively and diverse, since, as usual with discussions over CAP, nothing is simple and straightforward. Indeed, I think the Cabinet Secretary and his staff have an impossible task in trying to reconcile all the competing interests. I'm also glad that we're having this debate now as part of the consultation stage, as from some of the, frankly, hysterical communication that I've had from the NFU in the North East, you would think that everything was done and dusted and everything was doom and gloom as far as farmers are concerned. However, the overreaction of the office bearers in the North East NFU does not seem to be replicated among the wider farming community, and this is evidenced by the optimism of the Bank of Scotland survey and the reporting in the P&G a newspaper which is very much has its finger on the pulse of the rural community throughout Scotland, which headlines, "Survey results are at odds with leaders' claims over CAP." So let me return to the straitjacket in which the Cabinet Secretary finds himself operating. Firstly, Europe broke the link between payments and production, so as a result, the Scottish Government is trying to support production when barred from doing so by the EU. We also have the Conservatives and their coalition partners arguing in EU negotiations for the single farm payments to be phased out altogether. So I find the words coming from Alec Ferguson a bit hollow. Things could be so much worse if Scottish farmers were left to the UK Government. This is on top of the UK Government's refusal to pass on the full convergence uplift, which all parties in this Parliament agreed was unacceptable. Perhaps some of the concerns of farmers would be overcome if we were arguing about how to divide a much bigger cake rather than just a slice, and it would be helpful if the NFU and Grampian put more of their energies into lobbying the Westminster Government on this. As my colleague Christian Allard said, if the French Government treated their farmers in this way, there would be very serious, obnoxious-smelling material dumped in front of the French Parliament and the Élysée Palace. Also, we note that the modulation rate suggested at 9.5% is lower than both England at 12% and Wales at 15%, and of course lower than that proposed by the Labour Party here, who proposed the full 15% as in Wales. So we have a situation where Scotland is discussing cuts when other countries are deciding how to invest their increases throughout Europe. Little wonder then that we see support for independence and, yes, among farmers moving in the right direction as they see the unfairness of the Westminster Government withholding funding and showing little support for the agriculture sector. In contrast, we see this Government's very active promotion of Scotland's food and drink sector, with this sector now accounting for 18% of Scotland's overseas exports compared with less than 1.5% of the UK as a whole. We know that Scotland can sell all the beef and lamb it produces, whether that's selling it at home or abroad, and we have the capacity to process all of the product. Those farmers who continue to strive to produce a premium product are rewarded with higher prices and a ready market for their products. The Cabinet Secretary has a difficult job to encourage our hill farmers to increase their cattle herds and sheep flocks to meet the demand, as this demand will only increase, not decrease. And I'm heartened by the Bank of Scotland survey, which shows that 32% of farmers believe they will increase their beef operation and only 12% decrease it, and 29% of sheep farmers anticipate increasing. And of course, the demand for barley increases as the whisky industry surges forward. While I didn't agree with much of what Claire Baker said, I do agree with her that the farming sector could make much better use of Pillar 2 and SRDP money. We must, Cabinet Secretary, increase headage and more land improvement to compensate for the far too much prime agricultural land which has been sold off at high prices to developers for housing. I commend the Cabinet Secretary in his work, knowing that he will find the best way forward for the whole of Scotland.
Many thanks for your brevity. Now call on Roderick Campbell to be followed by Dr Elaine Murray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Agriculture is of vital importance to Scotland. 3/4 of Scotland's land mass is used for agricultural ends, and the sector directly employs some 65,000 people. According to NFU Scotland, 1 in 10 Scottish jobs, that's 250,000, depend on agriculture in one way or another. So it's difficult, therefore, to overstate the importance of getting CAP reform right for Scotland. We know that the Cabinet Secretary, Richard Lochhead, works extremely hard within the current framework to protect Scotland's interests. But we also know that within the constraints of devolution, Scotland's interests are not always put first. Within the UK, Scotland plays second fiddle to the interests of the whole. That's the reason there was anger and disappointment last year when Scotland did not receive its proper share of convergence uplift payments, funding which the UK would not have received at all had it not been for Scotland's low average level Pillar 1 per hectare payments. And it's the reason why Scottish farmers have by a wide margin the lowest per hectare Pillar 2 payments of any member state, big or small, in the European Union. The EU average Pillar 2 funding per hectare is €76. Scotland's rate is just €11. And we know, of course, that Pillar 1 payments in Scotland are €100 lower than the UK average. And let's not forget Ireland, with a comparatively sized area of eligible Pillar 1 land receiving double Scotland's rate. In my view, the UK government has at times tended to take a somewhat patronising top-down approach in its dealings with the Scottish government. Owen Paterson told the Rural Affairs and Climate Change Committee last year, quote, "You must never underestimate the trouble to which I go to keep Richard Lockhead informed." But I think this does serve to highlight the fact that we need more than information. We need a more participative approach towards CAP at all levels, not just at the implementation stage. Speaking of participation, I welcome the 2 consultations published by the Scottish Government. The new model for the Scottish Rural Development Programme will, I hope, be welcomed for its relative simplicity and accessibility, something that perhaps it lacked before. As to the rate of modulation, in an ideal world, we would have wanted to wait until the consultation was complete before deciding on that. But I accept that the Cabinet Secretary had no choice on the matter. It was unavoidable. I understand that a wide range of views were expressed in the initial consultation as to the scale of the transfer. Some argued for more Pillar 2 funding and others argued for a greater retention of funds under Pillar 1. But I think that the agreed transfer of 9.5%, which will deliver a rural development budget of more than 1.3 billion, up to 2020, is a fair and balanced decision in the circumstances. But I hope that the Cabinet Secretary recognises the need to spend those funds efficiently and will take on board the results of the current consultation. I say to the Labour Party, yes, it's less than the transfers in Wales and England, but it does take account of the overall settlement to Scotland. And what would the Labour Party prefer? A bigger cut to Pillar 1 and all that entails? Claire Baker has rightly suggested at the end of her speech that the Cabinet Secretary has difficult decisions to make. By all means, yeah.
Claire Baker.
Would the member accept that if there were to be greater transfer between Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, the funds that are available in Pillar 2 are largely available to the farming sector and they are the main beneficiaries of that funding?
I wouldn't accept that fully. I would accept, as I say, her final point, that there are difficult decisions to make. But I think overall 9.5% is a reasonable figure in the circumstances. The government motion before us today implicitly recognises concerns surrounding farm payments and land use. People are right to be concerned about the practice of slipper farming. The practice of purchasing the right to claim farm payments on land that is not in production has been around for almost 9 years and is totally contrary to what ought to be the purpose of the payments. That is, supporting farmers who often work long, hard hours to earn their livelihood from productive farms. Slipper farming has been widely condemned by NFUS, the Scottish Government, and by members across the Chamber, not only because it unfairly rewards inactivity, but because it does so at the expense of genuine agriculture. But let's not forget that the change to a single farm payment and the decoupling from production was in 2003 widely supported. And also, although the so-called Scottish clause would have helped eliminate the practice, the Commission has ruled out a link between payment and production. So where do we go now? I heard what Alec Ferguson said in relation to the Scottish clause, and I think it would be helpful if the Cabinet Secretary was able to expand further on where we could go now with the Scottish clause in his closing remarks. Another important point on which the Scottish Government is consulting is the division of land into 2 regions. Is that sufficient? One for arable farming and permanent and temporary pasture, and one for rough grazing. Is it not a better idea to consider 3, as some people are suggesting, including NUF Scotland? Of course, the consultation does provide that third option, and I hope that the Cabinet Secretary will take on board, when he looks at the results of the consultation, the division of opinion on that point. It's clear that any single payment rate will inevitably benefit very low-intensity areas disproportionately. But no matter how Scotland's agricultural land is categorised by the Government, the total sum available to us does not change. The fact remains the CAP budget is being reduced. That's where the convergence uplift would have made a difference had the UK Government taken into account Scotland's interest. I pointed out in October that assigning new categories to different areas of land leaves Scotland with very little real choice, given the extent of less favoured area land and the amount of rough grazing. And as others have suggested, the slower the transition to a level playing field in 2019, the more less active farmers are protected in the interim. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, there's no doubt in my mind that difficult decisions need to be made, and the Cabinet Secretary has by no means an easy task. But it's reassuring to note that at least, according to the Scottish Agricultural Survey 2014, as Maureen Watts already referred to, 34% rate the Scottish Government as good or very good on agricultural issues.
Must draw to a close, please.
That's up from 31% last year. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. Now call on Dr Elaine Murray to be followed by Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I too share the disappointment expressed by others that Scotland's share of Pillar 1 direct support has decreased and that the convergence uplift has not been passed on to Scotland, as it was our low level of payment per hectare which enabled the UK as a whole to qualify through averaging less than the 90% threshold. And as has been said already, there was unanimity last October across the parties that Scotland should receive the entirety of this funding, and it is very regrettable, I have to say, that the UK Government failed to listen even to its own party colleagues in Scotland on this issue, even if it were not prepared to listen to the Scottish Government or indeed to the Scottish Labour Party. But although the payment per hectare in Scotland in 2019 will be under half the UK average, as Claire Baker has already said, it is important to remember that though these payments are indeed very low, the average payment per farmer is £25,751 per annum. That is 5 times the EU average and some £8,000 higher than the average in England. Yes.
Stuart Stevenson.
I wonder if the member, in reading the Bank of Scotland report, noted that less than 1/3 of farmers would be able to trade profitably without support from CAP.
Dr Murray.
I think if you listen to how I intend to develop this argument, you may be more greatly in agreement with it than you think at the moment, because the disparity arises because we have some very large landowners in Scotland. Indeed, I know that the Environment Minister has made a comment recently about the need for further land reform. And if you look at the spread of funding, it shows a huge increase between the 9th and 10th decile of about £200,000, with the 10th decile, these are the top 10%, being awarded over, over twice the second top decile. D. Whiteman has estimated that the top 10% of farmers receive almost 49% of the total subsidy in 2011. Over 2/3 of the subsidy has gone to the top 20% of farmers. So there's clearly a considerable imbalance, with large landowners receiving large amounts of subsidy. Now, I know that many farmers support a cap on payments. The NFUS is strongly opposed to it. But a cap would provide a mechanism to release funding for rural development, and I'd be interested in the Cabinet Secretary's views on that matter. Because, as colleagues have already said, environmental organisations feel that the Cabinet Secretary has been a little timid in his proposed transfer of 9.2% to Pillar 2, given that a maximum of 15% is permitted. Pillar 2 can support measures to combat and mitigate climate change, to address the loss of biodiversity, and that's a problem in Scotland as it is across Europe, to improve water and soil quality, and to invest in community development. And while I think I can understand the Government's argument that the low payment per hectare to Scotland by the UK Government made it more difficult for the Scottish Government to match commitment to Pillar 2, shown, for example, by the Welsh Government, capping the funds received by Scotland's largest landowners could have released funds for other measures. No, sorry, we're tight for time and I've already taken on, I'm sorry. I would also welcome the Cabinet Secretary's view in another issue which I brought to the debate last time we had a debate on CAP reform, but I don't think he actually answered it at the time. And that was the view taken by COSLA at its convention on the 28th of June last year, that at least a third of the EU funding in the 2014-19 period, including our SRDP and maritime programmes in Scotland, should be allocated to local authorities for distribution. And I stress for distribution, not for keeping for themselves. COSLA made this request in anticipation, quite rightly, as it happens, that direct payments would decrease, and clearly this would have the greatest impact on rural areas. Now, if the SRDP is sufficiently flexible, local councils and others through a community planning mechanism would be able to mitigate the effects of Pillar 1 reductions by supporting local economic and social programmes tailored to the needs, priorities and opportunities of specific areas. Now, I am a passionate supporter of devolution, as many in the Chamber will know, but for me, devolution is not simply about the appropriate powers being passed from Westminster to Edinburgh. It also is concerned with passing powers from Edinburgh to more local levels, when that enables decisions to be made which are more sensitive to local needs and priorities. Scotland's rural and coastal communities are diverse. Even within a region like Dumfries and Galloway, the challenges and opportunities vary between areas. Langham's issues are different to Upper Nithsdale's, different to SL Muir's, different to the Mull of Galloway, and so on. The rules around the allocation of funding from national organisations can't always be flexible enough to reflect these differences. Whereas allowing local authorities and others to use a community planning approach to a basket of EU funds, which might include structural, rural and maritime funding streams. Now, this has the potential to ensure that these funds are used to complement each other and to achieve maximum value for money. Community-led development, skills and needs training, business support and measures to tackle deprivation could be coordinated to complement each other and to deliver maximum effect where this is required. As I said earlier, I raised COSLA's proposal on the CAP debate on the 3rd of October last year, and I don't know whether there have been any meetings between local and national government since then to further explore these possibilities. I reiterated that I'm not suggesting that local authorities should hang on to these funds, rather than they should be enabled to distribute a portion of the EU funding streams, which could operate alongside their own community grant schemes and actually reinforce those too. However, I do note that the current consultation SRDP has a number of elements along these lines. Leader, we know, for example, has always been intended to be bottom-up and partnership-based. And in the consultation document, I note it is suggested that rural and coastal areas will be invited to submit a local development strategy, and that partnerships, including larger towns with a local rural hinterland, are also being encouraged. Finally, like other contributors, I reject the notion that Scotland would automatically receive a better deal as an independent nation. The CAP receipts to Scotland would have to be renegotiated if Scotland becomes independent and agreed by all 28 member states. It is true, yes, that Scotland has lost out on Pillar 1 support, but a yes vote this year won't change that one little bit.
Many thanks. Now call on Stuart Stevenson to be followed by Jim Hume. 6 minutes or thereby, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And let me just start by reminding members of my registered agricultural holding. It is of 3 acres and I receive no money, public or private, as a result of having it, so it probably doesn't matter very much. The Bank of Scotland does an annual survey of agriculture and published it at 11 o'clock yesterday morning. And there's a number of interesting things in that survey. First of all, the numbers rating the Scottish Government as good or not good, as already been mentioned, has risen. But more critically in relation to this debate, 89% of farmers are against single farm payments going to inactive farmers. And I think that's something that commands pretty broad support in the Chamber, in principle, if diversity in recognising there are different ways of moving from the current position to one that is more appropriate. And, as I said in my most recent intervention, only about 1/3 of farms are reporting that they'd be profitable without the single farm payments. However, in relation to what the government is proposing, 2/3 of respondents said they were in favour of calf subsidy payments. And it's interesting to turn to that indispensable guide to all things farming, this week's Private Eye. And that praises our Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs to the skies. At least in Scotland, politicians seem determined to extract some food production from farmers in exchange for taxpayer cash. And it goes on. If Lockheed's initiative succeeds in starting to revive Scottish beef farming, maybe Paterson will have to consider a similar scheme for England. For that to happen, he would first have to brave the howls of well-orchestrated protest from English farmers used to being paid £3 billion a year without having to produce a thing. Yes, I will.
Stuart Stevenson. That Private Eye is essentially a satirical magazine.
Stuart Stevenson.
I will bear that in mind next time. It makes reference to my perorations here and elsewhere. But I think Bio-Waste Spreader, for that is the pseudonym under which the agri-brigade column is written, is someone who writes with genuine and informed views on the agricultural sector. But you can play it both ways. But at least I think he's captured the essence of the debate. Now, on Pillar 2, the Government is proposing quite a lot of interesting things. Less favoured areas support, £459 million. The Agri-Environment Climate Scheme, 355. Forestry, 252. New entrants, an area where I think there's fairly widespread view that we need to try and do more, 20 million for farmers up to the age of 40 years old, and that's an EU constraint. And for crofting and small farms, 20 million and 10 million for cooperative ventures as well. Now, the stakeholders have responded in a variety of different ways, but in particular, the NFU do focus on the theme that's running through this debate from all sides of the chamber, and that is the imbalance between the EU's objectives in providing money to the UK and where the UK has delivered it. And the NFU in particular, the Spice briefing tells us, has said that it would be, in essence, it would be inequitable for arable farmers in Berwickshire to receive a different amount from those in Norfolk, or hill farmers in the Highland to receive a different amount from those in the Lake District. And I think it's quite easy to agree with that observation from the NFU. I want to just pick up one particular thing. Elaine Murray, I beg your pardon, Claire Baker, made reference to Finland and said how much better they were doing on environmental issues. And let's just pick up the numbers. Finland in 2019, in direct payments per hectare, will get €230. Scotland, by contrast, will get 120, just over half. And of course, as we know, on rural development funding per hectare, in Finland it will be €148, whereas in Scotland it will be 12. It's easier to do better if you've more to do better with. And that is the fundamental failure of the present arrangements, whereby our interests are represented not by ministers from this Parliament, but from elsewhere. I no longer have time. Do forgive me. I'm in my last 45 seconds. Now, the amendments that are before us, well and good. I can certainly agree that the cross-party representations were useful, but I think that in aiming for 9.5%, the Cabinet Secretary has got it just about right. Rod Campbell, like myself, focused on the number of areas that we should look at. Farmers are essentially saying it's got to be 2, 3 or 4, with 3 aggregating as much support as 2 and 3, and I think we ought to look at that again, because that's where farmers are coming from. Let's not throw forestry out. Forestry is a very important contributor to dealing with climate change, and I can't help noticing the members' debate this evening is on Scotland's national tree. Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. I now call Jim Hume to be followed by Joan McAlpine.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I remind the Chamber of my register of interest. I don't think there's any doubt across the Chamber of the importance of agriculture to Scotland. Scottish food and drink is generally a success story and one that we all want to encourage to grow. But the Scottish farmer last month reported on Scottish beef prices becoming the most expensive in the world at around 430 pence per deadweight kilo, due to the severe shortage and, of course, high demand for the product, which is, you may think, good news for some, but that shortage is worrying for long-term sustainability of the industry. We've seen closure of abattoirs due to lack of throughput. The Scottish Association of Meat Wholesalers reckon that the number of Scottish suckler cows has reduced by 60,000 down to 450,000 in only 9 years. That's a 12% reduction. A decline that I think we would all want to tackle. So we need to see an increase in the number of cattle, not decrease. And of course, we are now in the UK reliant on imports to satisfy the needs of the beef demand. Presiding Officer, rough grazing classified land is the breeding ground for Scottish beef and lamb, and is the most fragile of communities that we have. My amendment, which unfortunately wasn't taken, mentioned the treatment of rough grazing in a uniform matter, as is suggested by the Government at the moment, as flawed. These aren't my words, but are the words of the NFU of Scotland. In fact, they go further to say it, and I quote, fundamentally flawed and risks production, communities and infrastructure in our largest and most fragile region." Unquote. They go on to state that the most intensively stocked hills will be subject to heavy cuts that will trigger accelerated destocking. I have evidence in my own region to back this, not myself or my sons who farm the home farm, but a tenant farmer from my region has given me actual figures, and he'd be happy to share them with the Cabinet Secretary or Minister, who obviously represents the same area, showing that his farm would lose some 50% of support. That's a farm that rises to over 2,000 feet, where there is no option of different crops, of course. A farm like many across Scotland that is the breeding place for the Scottish beef and lamb, and one we can all be proud of. And that's an active farm that will have as many sheep and cattle as they did back in the 14 years ago when the historic payments relate back to. So I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary or Minister would agree to meet myself in this business or others that I could bring to discuss the consequences of a uniform payment regime for rough grazing land. That uniform scheme, which would bizarrely hit the active farms worse, whilst at the same time benefit those extensive hill lands with little activity and what some of us would recognise and call slipper farmers. So will the Cabinet Secretary examine the possibility of applying different payment rates for rough grazing land on objective criteria, as NFUS is strongly suggesting? Presiding Officer, I also mentioned in my untaken amendment the importance of home UK market of 60 million people. I recently visited a successful farming and food business employing some 230 people and turning over around £52 million per year. Not a typical farming business, of course, but an important driver of a rural economy. They sell 20% of their product with the saltire on it to our home market. The very same product, 75% of their business, also gets the Union Jack stamped on it and sold south of the border. English are as conscious about perceiving to buy local as we are. That business, unprovoked by myself, said they'd have to move production south of the border to retain the ability to sell their product as local, taking jobs and monies from Scotland. Currently, I think we have the best of three worlds. We can sell as a product of UK, as Scotland and the EU. And the EU is, of course, a market of some 500 million potential customers, around 7% of the world population. So why risk that? Yes, of course.
Minister.
Will Jim Hume accept that Ireland, for instance, exports the same as, if not more, per head of population to the English market than Scotland? Why is it okay for independent Ireland able to export its food and drink to England, but somehow our constitutional status up here has a bearing on the choice of consumers south of the border?
Jim Hume.
I recognise the Irish situation, but I'm just quoting exactly from a business that employs some 230 people. The EU, of course, has been in debate in another place. I know the Tories would like a referendum on that matter, and for the record, Lib Dems are fully in favour of staying in the EU, and if the Tories are ever in a position to deliver the referendum, I will be campaigning to stay in the European Union. It's not only important for Scottish agriculture and the support it gives to the farming world and environment through CAP, it also is a free market that we can access without boundaries. And to turn to Scottish lamb, that is driven by the European demand for that product. And I don't want to see a time when that's put at risk either by a UK separating from Europe or a Scotland separating from the UK and potentially Europe at the same time. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Liberal Democrats backed the Scottish Government for the convergent uplift to come to Scotland, highlighting the unanimous view that Scottish agriculture is a priority. I therefore again offer the Lib Dems the chance to join the Cabinet Secretary in meetings to further this, and hope the Cabinet Secretary doesn't use it as a tool to create differences between North and South. The industry, I believe, is aware that if Scotland were to become independent, there is no guarantee that Scotland would automatically gain access without negotiation, without knowledge if the rebate would be transferred automatically to Scotland, and without knowledge if there would be a cap at all, of course.
You must conclude,
so I would like the Minister, in his closing remarks, to particularly address the rough grazing uniform treatment. And, of course, I welcome this consultation and encourage others to put in their input into it.
Thank you. I call Joan McAlpine to be followed by Rob Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. My regional office is in Dumfries and Galloway, and that's one of the reasons why CAP funding is of particular interest to me.
Could you pull your mic, Ms McAlpine, pull your microphone round? Thank you.
The region of Dumfries and Galloway has roughly 40% of Scotland's dairy herd, 19% of its beef cattle, 15% of its sheep, but only 3% of Scotland's people. In 2011, according to research by the Crichton Institute, approximately 10% of the working population of Dumfries and Galloway worked on farms, and 8% of Scottish holdings were located in the region. For these stark reasons, the new EU Common Agricultural Policy is of vital importance, and there is absolutely no doubt, Presiding Officer, that Dumfries and Galloway, a region with economic challenges despite its vital contribution to our agricultural sector, would benefit substantially from a yes vote this September. An area which accounts for a well above average share of dairy and beef herds and agricultural holdings would surely be at the front of the queue for improved CAP. The EU table breaking down Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 payments per hectare is nothing short of a scandal for Scotland and for our rural economy, which has such an influence on the lives and opportunities of my constituents. The UK, as others have pointed out, has failed to negotiate an acceptable agricultural budget allocation. That is indeed an understatement. We are bottom of the funding tables for both Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 now. The UK Government has let Scotland down badly, and unlike 16 other member states, it did not negotiate extra resources for rural development. Those funds underpin a vital range of projects and services in my constituency, everything from encouraging diversification into tourism to providing training for young people. It's simply beyond comprehension that Ireland will receive twice as much Pillar 1 funding as Scotland and a staggering 7 times as much Pillar 2. To quote another example, the Czech Republic has a smaller Pillar 1 eligible area than Scotland, but gets 1.5 times as much to fund Pillar 1 as Scotland. On Pillar 2, Denmark, with less than 2/3 of the agricultural area of Scotland, has an average per hectare Pillar 2 rate, which is more than 2.5 times as high as Scotland. That's €31 per hectare compared to €11 per hectare for Scotland. If Scotland had been an independent country at the start of negotiations for the 2014-2019 EU agricultural budget, the formula agreed for that budget, which applies to all member states, Scotland's farmers and our rural areas would be €1 billion better off. While a detailed breakdown is not available, it stands to reason that my constituents in Dumfries and Galloway would be well placed to benefit from a substantial proportion of that €1 billion uplift, and an above-average percentage of the 2,500 rural jobs that the Scottish Government has calculated that such an extra €1 billion would create. Presiding Officer, what a missed opportunity. I cannot emphasise enough that it is not just farmers who lose out from this missed opportunity. To quote the Dumfries and Galloway Local Development Plan, agriculture is integral to many tourism enterprises and has a major impact on food and drink, both in terms of food processing and direct sales. The Scottish Farmer just this month published a poll that showed 47% of respondents will vote yes this September. It really is no surprise given the UK Government's failures in this regard. I would like to finish by quoting a South of Scotland farmer who, far from regarding the constitutional debate as marginal to her business, considers it to be central. Carol Douglas from Roxburghshire has said Westminster governments have argued for a significant reduction in farming payments, despite the fact we already get the worst farming deal as part of the UK. That constituent has joined farming for yes. Lastly, while the situation is poor right now, there is also the prospect of agricultural support being cut completely if Scotland remains in the political union with England and England votes to leave the EU in an in-out referendum. Scottish agriculture and our rural industries will be in the hands of a Westminster government with a stated policy of drastically reducing or even ending farm payments altogether. That would be a disaster, Presiding Officer. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now call Rob Gibson to be followed by Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm very glad to support the Government's motion at this time, and I believe that we should dig into the views of how farming sees itself at the moment and just understand what the pressures are upon it. Just recently, the NFU leadership met with George Eustace, the UK Farm Minister. As we were told in the Scottish Farmer on Burns Night, our main competitors, Nigel Miller says, are the north and south of Ireland. Both have budgets that are more than double that of Scotland per hectare and a focus on production. that means that, although it's been said by many people before, that's a stunning figure. He went on to say that the UK has the ability to open the door for coupled area top-up support to be used in Scotland's huge rough grazing areas, a point I'll come back to, and he's saying that ball is in the UK's court to help. The UK's role in Scotland's CAP reform implementation was limited, except that it controlled the foundation of support, the budget, and through coupling held a vital lever that allows support to be targeted at production. Therefore, you can understand why farmers like Jim Brown of Gaindyke Head Farm near Airdrie said, as we've seen from DEFRA Minister Owen Patterson and the UK Government's action over the recent debacle of the CAP convergence funding, they do not have Scottish farming's interest at heart and indeed are taking decisions which remove vital funding from Scotland. The amendments do not take this into account, and I'm not taking an intervention because I'd like to get on and look at an issue that's not been dealt with so far. That is the three-crop rule.
We do have a slight bit of extra time just to let the Chamber know.
Thank you. I may take others, but at the moment I want to make progress. The three-crop rule, as we've been told, relates to perhaps 800 to 900 farmers in the northeast of Scotland and in the Highlands who are growing malting barley as their key crop. Now, the EU insists that monoculture is something that's got to be reduced, but these farmers are attempting to meet the market demand for their product. Now, there are constraints on what they can produce because it has been said that 40% of spring barley may be unsuitable for malting, but any interruption in the crops that they grow can reduce the availability of Scottish barley going into Scotch malt whisky. Therefore, it's important for us to try and find some way to help farms, because mostly they're well over 75 acres and therefore they're 75 hectares, so therefore they do require our support. And I hope that the Cabinet Secretary can say something about that. I'm aware in this circumstance that, in fact, that spring barley and so on is one aspect to it, and some of them also grow wheat. But there's been problems about the price of maize and the price of wheat. But because grain prices in the world are going up, the maize which is being used in grain distilleries may well become too expensive. So it's important that we're growing the correct kind of wheat to help those farmers. Now, I was pretty appalled, I have to say, at the remarks made by the Conservative lead, Alec Ferguson, a renowned member of our Rural Affairs Committee. But to talk about 100 acres of rock in the north, what it produces, getting support, is something which I have to take to task. For a start, they produce often the biodiversity that this country requires, and that is paid for as a public good. They don't undermine it like certain intensive practices do in other parts of the country. The carrying capacity on such land is much lower, and it would be foolish to have a large number of cattle or sheep on that, and that has to be taken into account. They are the least favoured areas, and therefore, in order to keep people, biodiversity and scenery, it's important that we make sure that we have a proper support in this CAP for those areas. Alec Ferguson.
Alec Ferguson.
I'm grateful to the member for taking intervention, and I accept his remarks. I hope he will accept that I was not trying to denigrate these acres. I was simply trying to, perhaps in overflowery language, refer to the unacceptable situation of rewarding ground that produces absolutely nothing at all, i.e. slipper and non-active farming.
Rob Gibson, I can reimburse you.
I do accept that. The fact that there are a few Tories elected in the Highlands and Islands may reflect the fact that people don't share the original views that he stated. But talking about slipper farmers, I see in an advert under the name of CJD Galbraith, Scotland's leading single farm payment broker, that single farm payment entitlements for sale and wanted, the trading season is now open. But 89% of farmers in the Bank of Scotland survey say that they're against single farm payments going to inactive farmers. So When are we going to expose the people who are buying and selling? I think it's essential that the CAP reveals this, and at present there's been far too much of a cover-up about payments as a whole, because they are businesses, and whether they're in the name of an individual, they should not be protected at all. Now, I have to say that the Scottish Government performance has been overall positive, where it does the things like pay single farm payments and supports renewables and so on. But we can see there's a considerable concern about change, about the way that the reform in the CAP is being handled, about the way in which new entrants are being supported or not. And we have to balance these. It's a very difficult job, and I hope that the Cabinet Secretary gets all of our support to make sure we get the best deal for Scottish rural areas and farmers.
Thank you. I do have a few minutes in hand. I can compensate for interventions if members choose to take them. Rhoda Grant, to be followed by Angus MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the consultation, but we've been here during previous CAP reforms before, and no changes have been made that support crofting and farming in the Highlands and Islands. Every time the whole reform is skewed widely out of shape to ensure that he who hath, it shall be given, and you can be sure that he or she never lived in the Highlands and Islands. We now come to a crunch moment for the new CAP, where the European Commission has made it possible, or should I say, has made it almost compulsory to have a fairer division of CAP. And we'll wait and see what this Scottish Government makes of these policies and how they'll impact in Scotland. At the moment, it's nothing short of scandalous that 2/3 of payments go to 20% of farmers, as Elaine Murray pointed out, and they take hundreds of thousands of pounds each, and some of them are slipper farmers, and indeed limited companies are among them as well. On the other side of the scale, we see crofters and farmers on the periphery struggling to keep going while receiving a pittance in CAP payments. The current allocation and funding does nothing to encourage farming and crofting in disadvantaged areas, and this consultation doesn't seem to want to right that wrong at all. The James Hutton Institute modelled across Scotland. Areas within the Highlands and Islands seemed likely to come out quite well from those dispassionate calculations. The Highlands and Islands Agricultural Support Group, which is made up of all the local authorities from Argyll to Shetland, worked in a spirit of openness and trust with the Scottish Government to test the modelling upon which those payments could be based. Then, at the last minute, it seems to have vanished, and we're presented with a consultation cynically designed to keep the money where it has always been. As usual, nothing changes, and as usual, the Highlands and Islands look like they're being left out in the cold. Unless there is a public commitment from the Cabinet Secretary to the region, over half the land area in Scotland will be disadvantaged yet again. In this consultation, we see a payment of €20 to €25 being proposed for this area. This figure is far, far too low. It's not justified by any of the detailed work done. It could damage crofting and farming in the Highlands and Islands and appears to ignore completely the work of those groups that I mentioned. And we even hear rumours that a still lower RGR payment is being considered. And I hope that the Cabinet Secretary will deny that today in winding up and give a commitment that it will not happen. We saw the environmental impact that decoupling payments from production had in sheep farming in the Highlands and Islands, and it was close to impossible back then to make a living, with many of the industry working elsewhere to subsidise their farming activities. And therefore, when production was no longer required, sheep came off the hills in their millions. And this led to the devastation of the support industries downstream from that sheep farming. It destabilised communities and made it even more difficult for those who remained in the area to make a living. The environmental damage caused by the lack of land management and grazing was on a scale that we never thought possible. If the Cabinet Secretary implements a payment of €25 or less, it will be equally catastrophic for our communities and the environment. It will also be very difficult to support those communities that are dependent on agricultural activity, and I see that this is neither greener or indeed fairer at all. Add to this that is deferred any changes to LFAS until 2017, way beyond the referendum. Therefore, there is no other mechanism available for us to support crofting and farming in my region. The current LFAS payments actually are applied in exactly the opposite way as to how they were intended. The richer you are, the more you get. It's not used at all to address disadvantage. The Scottish Government can implement changes to the scheme at any time it likes. It's the Cabinet Secretary's choice. I fear this consultation is more about trying to win the votes of large farmers for independence rather than court those of small crofters and farmers in my area. I would say to the Cabinet Secretary, they might get the lion's share of the funding, but they only have one vote each, as do the people he disregards in his consultation. Therefore, I ask, let him speak up for the Highlands and Islands for a change.
Thank you. And I now call Angus MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We've heard this afternoon a number of arguments for where specific payments should be made within the CAP framework. So let me, at the outset, make a specific plea and give an example of my own with regard to some issues that I'm aware of which are affecting the Western Isles before I move on to the substance of the debate. Clearly, the continuation of less favoured area support in 2014 and hopefully 2015 is imperative for the survival of the economies of rural and remote communities throughout Scotland and to avoid uncertainty in these areas. However, any future move to ANC or areas facing natural constraints will have to be handled extremely carefully if we're not to see more stock disappearing from the common grazings and our hills. And can I say, just at this point, that Alex Ferguson's comment earlier regarding 100 acres of black rock in the northwest of Scotland is extremely offensive. In the northwest of Scotland, producing nothing is extremely offensive to farmers and crofters in that area struggling to make a living. Now, I know he has since clarified his point, however, I'm sure his comments have been noted up in the northwest of Scotland. I also have to question Rhoda Grant's comments just moments ago regarding the cynical consultation. Can I suggest to Rhoda Grant, through the Chair, that she should perhaps speak to some of the members of Crofters for Yes and Farmers for Yes who come from the Western Isles and the northwest of Scotland, who could well perhaps put her more in the picture with regard to their input into the consultation. To give the Chamber some examples of challenges Western Isles farmers and crofters are currently facing, a round bale of hay, which costs between £12 and £15 in Aberdeen, has been sold in Stornoway for £46, and an £8 round bale of straw is selling in Stornoway for £30. Animal feed's an extra £70 per tonne, and fertiliser is between £140 and £160 dearer in Stornoway than it is in Inverness. So with added costs like that, it's welcome news that the CAP consultation includes proposals for a crofting and small farm support scheme designed to deliver enhanced environmental and business benefits which will go some way towards mitigating the crippling costs of transporting any animal feed or fertiliser to Outer Hebrides and, of course, other islands. Now, over the past few months, we've heard numerous calls from industry bodies such as NFUS for the best budget deal possible in order to meet the challenges of moving forward from a historic to an area-based system. And with a proactive approach, we can help manage change and support agricultural businesses in the period beyond 2015. The situation is not helped, however, by poor representation at UK level when negotiations are underway in Europe. As we've seen recently, the debate on the CAP convergence uplift is a prime example of how Scotland's farmers and crofters would be better served by an independent Scotland with a seat at the top table. Scotland's farmers and crofters have lost out to the tune of €223 million thanks to the retention, some would call it theft, by the UK Government of convergence uplift allocated to the UK because of the situation in Scotland. Well, I'm sorry, I've already halfway through. I need to get on. As if that wasn't bad enough, we've had to endure the fact that if Scotland were currently independent, our farmers and crofters would have gained an additional €1 billion of support through Pillar 1 of the CAP, based on the principle that no member state would receive less than the average of €196 per hectare, which would have been of massive benefit to rural businesses the length and breadth of Scotland. To add insult to injury, because we're not yet independent, we've lost out on the opportunity to join 16 other EU countries in negotiating hundreds of millions of euros more in rural development funding, money that could have boosted investment in rural tourism, environmental protection, broadband rollout and renewables, not to mention more start-up assistance for young farmers. No, I'm sorry, I need to get on. Okay, on you go.
Jim Hume.
Thank you very much for allowing the intervention. The member's gone on about how terrible Westminster is, of course, but what's the member's view on SNP MPs down in Westminster who voted to slash the EU budget where CAP comes from?
Mr MacDonald, I'll reimburse you for the intervention.
Okay, we of course have other issues with the Lib Dems with regard to fishing policy in Europe, not following the line that their party profess. And of course we also have the outrageous situation of the refusal by the UK government to return the red meat levy from south of the border, which could be used to promote our own premium products of Scotch beef and lamb worldwide, not as is currently the case helping to promote produce from our competitors. Not only has Westminster failed to negotiate a better deal for Scotland, but our position is getting comparatively worse. So when the next round of CAP negotiations commence around 2018, an independent Scotland will be in a strong position to negotiate a much better deal for our farmers and crofters. Of course, if Scotland votes no on the 18th of September and we're still in the United Kingdom, there's a strong likelihood of agricultural support being cut completely if Westminster's planned in-out European referendum results in us leaving the EU, as my colleague Joan McAlpine mentioned earlier. Scottish agriculture and our rural industries will no longer be part of CAP, and we will be at the mercy of a Westminster Government committed to drastically reducing or even ending farm payments, which I suspect is a prospect not many here want, although I guess there's one or two in the chamber. In contrast, with independence, Scotland will qualify for future member state funding increases. And now, if I can just remind the chamber that as recently as just a few months back, we saw the Lib Dems, the Tories and Labour, in the guise of Tavish Scott, Alex Ferguson and Claudia Beamish, stand here promising to join the Cabinet Secretary in standing up to the UK Government on behalf of Scotland. Tavish Scott committed to doing this because, as he said, there is no question that the Minister's argument in relation to the funds coming to Scotland based on equal payment share is the right argument. Alex Ferguson reiterated his previously stated commitment to this cause, saying, "I accept the case for the external convergence uplift largely to come to Scotland. There is a perfectly logical case to be made, and I will do so." And Claudia Beamish pledged, "There is a strong case for the uplift to come here, and we in Scottish Labour will work with the Cabinet Secretary to try and achieve that." And to be fair, they did, all signing up to a joint letter on the subject, clearly unaware that Owen Paterson had every intention of saying no, and that was that. End of story. Do I have some extra time, Presiding Officer?
I've given you a minute extra, and I've indicated to the closing speeches that the speakers they can have extra, but I can give you a few more seconds. Okay,
thank you. Well, in closing, Presiding Officer, now that the Unionist parties in this chamber like to say that the SNP promised the grass will be greener with independence, of course it will be. Let's consider the alternative to independence, within or without the EU. Labour betray their underlying attitude to agriculture with their amendment today, which compares a 9.5% modulation in Scotland with 15% on the part of the Welsh. Following the Welsh example would leave even less funding in Pillar 1, not exactly what the NFUS or the Scottish Beef Association want to hear. And the Tories are committed firmly to chipping away at Pillar 1 until it's gone. And of course, if the Conservatives succeed in leading the UK out of the EU, then you can be sure that the market will be left to decide. So, Presiding Officer, it's becoming increasingly clearer there's only one way to save Scottish agriculture, and that's to vote yes on September the 18th.
Thank you. We now turn to closing speeches. I have a little bit of time in hand due to some members not using their full allocation. I call on Jamie McGregor. Up to 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I refer members to my agricultural interests in the Register of Members' Interests. I'm pleased to close today's debate for the Scottish Conservatives. I agree with those who have spoken today about the importance of the two consultations underway, and I would encourage farming and crofting constituents to take part. And if they don't agree with the RGR payment options that the NFU suggest, then they should suggest alternatives. And I'm very aware that there are strongly held views about the options available, and there is real anxiety in the farming sector, particularly the beef sector, as Jim Hume explained, and also the genuine hill livestock farmers about their future. I first started farming in Argyllshire on severely disadvantaged land in the 70s. We had the hill compensatory allowance then, the hill livestock compensatory allowance. Of course, that was a headage payment, and of course you didn't have to worry about slipper farmers and things then. it made me very aware of the importance of the thread of agriculture through so many ancillary industries, such as the livestock markets, livestock haulage, the feed and fertilizer businesses, and also the regular sheep and cattle sales in the Highlands and Islands at the local markets throughout the area, which play a huge part in the social life of the inhabitants. And sadly, this important element has been diminishing as farming has got more difficult. Well, yes, I will.
Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you very much. I wonder if the member has noticed again in the Bank of Scotland survey that there is a prospective rise in the amount of cattle that farmers expect to have, and does he welcome the proposals to provide support for smaller farmers in less advantaged areas to take cattle, which of course will feed through to the finishing sector in other parts of the industry?
Jamie McGregor. Absolutely, I agree with that, and also because those areas are the seed corn for the rest of the industry, and I agree with that. The subsidy element is obviously vital, but also farmers would like to see less bureaucracy and fewer complicated compliance penalties and a more can-do attitude which used to exist among the government agricultural departments, who used to be so helpful to farmers, but now sometimes are actually feared by the farmers working the land. And the amount of paperwork now required is making farming less productive and less profitable than it could be. And it is therefore employing fewer people, and more importantly, fewer young people. And if you live in a rural area with single-track roads, and there's a storm, and trees block the roads, or drains and culverts gets blocked, it's always the farmers who come out with their tractors and clear these things. And if they weren't there, they'd be sadly missed. Now, the SNP members have, I suppose predictably, used much of their time in this debate to attack the UK government. But they have conveniently ignored the feeling that the Scottish government appears to have been outmanoeuvred, or should I say outlobbied, in the negotiations by the Welsh and the Northern Irish and the English NFU. And they and the Cabinet Secretary would perhaps be better employed in engaging with the UK government in its review of allocations. That's something that the National Farmers Union of Scotland is keen to do. And the immediate focus is, of course, for the Scottish Government to come forward with the best possible new scheme. Much concern has been voiced to me by farmers in my region of the Highlands and Islands, especially hill sheep producers, including representatives of the National Sheep Association and the Scottish Black-Faced Sheep Breeders Association. As the NFUS said in their letter to the Cabinet Secretary on Monday this week, the core implementation programme outlined in the Scottish Government consultation fails to provide a viable support framework for a significant part of the Scottish farming and will exert a downward pressure on production across a number of key sectors. Now, there's been significant criticism of any final decision to have only 2 payment regions in Scotland. A single rough grazing region based on a flat rate of euros per hectare would inevitably penalise the more intensively stocked hills, which would in turn accelerate destocking. And, you know, it's about numbers. I have talked about the need to retain sheep and cattle on our hills on many occasions in this chamber, and I want to emphasise that again. The farming of sheep and cattle in our hills is fundamental to retaining population and underpinning the economies, often fragile and remote and rural, and all these island communities as well. All of us would accept that splitting the rough grazing region into 2 or more regions on objective criteria might be difficult, but getting this aspect of the reform right is vital, and this is more important than having a simple system. As our amendment today makes clear, the NFUS briefing contains the example of the Orkney Beef and Sheep Family Farm with 100 cows, 130 sheep, currently receiving support payments of around €60,000 on 110 hectares of land, inclusive of the beef calf scheme. Under the government's new proposals, this income would come down to about €32,000, inclusive of the beef calf scheme. This is an indication of the scale of the challenge some producers will face. Now, some will say that Orkney is fertile compared to Shetland or the Western Isles, because they're all in my region. But this is true, but so much of Orkney's economy depends on agriculture, and their reputation for high-quality livestock is second to none, as anyone who cares to visit the annual Orkney show will see for themselves. Agriculture in Orkney is sustainable, but it won't be if it's drawn down to the levels suggested in what I have just outlined. Now, coming back to the areas that are seriously disadvantaged, it is vital that the rough grazing figure is high enough to restore traditional hill farming to a healthy state. Over the past 3 decades, employment in highland agriculture has declined because, despite subsidies, the outputs have consistently outweighed the inputs. The new CAP must be a chance, or must be seen as a chance, to reverse this. Now, Rob Gibson mentioned public good coming from rocks, but I think he probably meant from peatlands, which have been discussed much in this chamber. And, of course, peatlands are a sink for carbon and therefore do produce a lot of public good. And hopefully there will be measures to recognise this in the CAP in Pillar 2. And I believe that there will be a chance to do that for restoration of peatlands, and this may help areas like Sutherland and Wester Ross, and Argyllshire for that matter. Now, Alex Ferguson was completely right when he said that farmers need certainty and clarity about the new support regime. It is the only way plans can be made for the future. The Cabinet Secretary, God bless him, must ensure final decisions are made as quickly as possible after the consultations close. We would also be supportive of calls from the NFUS for appropriate transition measures which are available to the Scottish Government. They are available.
Must conclude now, please.
I'm just about to. As the NFUS has said, to ignore a more managed approach up to 2019 would be an abdication of responsibility. And I support the amendment in the name of my esteemed and respected colleague, Alex Ferguson.
Thank you very much. Now calling Claudia Beamish with a maximum of 10 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm not sure I can live up to all these blessings and esteems, but I'll proceed anyway. This debate on the implementation of CAP reform comes at a time of fundamental importance for rural Scotland, and I believe has helped us to explore and expose the preferred options for these aspects, where there are choices to be made, particularly through the 2 consultations. Beyond today, our committee, the Rural Affairs Committee, will scrutinise, that scrutiny will be key to ensuring the way forward works for farmers and for the wider rural community, with stakeholder evidence after the close of consultations and evidence sessions with the UK Secretary of State and with the Cabinet Secretary, subject to our decision on our work programme on February the 5th. I speak today in support of our Labour amendment, and Scottish Labour amended to raise issues which we felt were not addressed by the Scottish Government motion. And while we agree that the UK Government decisions on the budget do limit the Scottish Government's decisions, it is still, of course, their responsibility to make the decisions, and the motion doesn't fully recognise that in our view. I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary in his closing remarks could tell us something about the contribution of the Future CAP stakeholder group and how that's developing. The consultation on Pillar 1 ends on the 17th of March, and how the future basic payments should be made, including the 30% greening and the National Reserve, are fundamental, along with a range of the other issues that have been raised by members today. The Scottish Government website tells us it has, I quote, lobbied hard to ensure Scotland's diverse farming needs were well represented in the reform policy, and we were involved in helping to shape solutions which will deliver for Scotland's farmers. Work is continuing on the fine detail of the system. And it goes on, the consultation seeks views on the 4 optional types of future direct support: voluntary coupled support, redistributive payments, Pillar 1 ANC payments and the small farmer scheme. I want to focus briefly on the small farmer scheme. And I believe that this would protect many farm businesses from cuts in support and may protect many ancillary businesses as well in communities such as in my region, in Lanarkshire, Ayrshire and Dumfriesshire, according to Crawford John Farmer and regional NFUS rep Tom French. I understand that over 70% of Scottish farm holdings are less than 50 hectares, although many farm businesses hold more than one holding. And I want to make a plea for small farmers and support for the higher rate of subsidy applied to the first 50 acres. Small family farms can play and do play a very important part in the local economy and social fabric, and this additional support may make the difference between keeping going and giving up. And the value of direct selling and shorter supply chains, along with research showing that higher biodiversity combined with higher productivity, all support this move, something that Nourish's briefing has highlighted to us. The response on the consultation on redistributive payments must be carefully analysed, as farms on rough grazing land, though, could lose out. My colleague Rhoda Grant has highlighted the issue of capping of basic payments, and Scottish Labour believes it is right there should be a cap, in spite of the argument sometimes put forward by large farm businesses about the employment benefit to the local economy they provide. We do not agree that there should be a public subsidy beyond this amount. And there are other more direct ways to support the rural economy through Pillar 2, and I understand this capping could release funds. Yes, I will.
Rob Gibson.
Very briefly, I wonder if you could tell us how much money you think would be actually put back into the system if there was such a cap.
Claudia Beamish.
I don't know the exact money that would be transferred to Pillar 2, but I understand it is quite substantial, and this would help with agri-environment schemes and with, indeed, with farmers in other ways and with the local economy. Rhoda Grant has made a plea for a careful assessment of her region, the Highlands and Islands, and I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary in his closing remarks could make reference to the new crofting scheme and beyond what Angus MacDonald highlights in relation to support for transport costs, which is obviously important. Can the Cabinet Secretary also inform us in his closing remarks anything about whether the ready reckoner in the consultation has been used and to what degree this has been found to be helpful? Because it does seem it's a good option for helping farmers with the future. There seems to be no dissent in the view that slipper farmers must be excluded, to state the obvious. However, I asked the Cabinet Secretary if the measures are yet robust enough, and his explanation that there will be a meeting next week is positive in this regard. But Nigel Miller stresses, and I quote, "We need the government to look at a suite of measures to lock out the misuse of money, and Rob Gibson's concerns about the buying and selling simply must be stopped." The Pillar 2 consultation ends at the end of February, and it is encouraging that the Scottish Government is committed to a simpler process which should make grants more accessible. The new SRDP does indeed need to be simple, straightforward, effective, customer-focused and accessible. And it must not be created as a package which fits computer and audit systems, which has been highlighted by some as a risk. Its simplicity, along with any new advisory service, must be people-centred. Cara Hilton highlights the disappointment of a range of environment groups that the Scottish Government has not followed the Welsh example and transferred the full 15% from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2, although we do support that 15%, but do acknowledge that there is a strong tension pulling in different directions for the Cabinet Secretary to have decided on. Graham Day covered the range of vital services in Pillar 2, and I want to highlight a few sections of the SRDP consultation in more detail. The Agri-Environment Climate Scheme is essential for our way forward in rural Scotland, and it is right that 27% of the future budget should be allocated to this, with increasing numbers of studies confirming, I quote from the consultation, the effectiveness in addressing public objectives for water quality, climate change and biodiversity. However, I asked the Cabinet Secretary to reassess access to this option, as it has been highlighted to me that some small farmers believe it is inaccessible to them, partly possibly because of the paperwork and those challenges. However, there is to be also a focus on cooperative action to secure landscape-scale improvements to the natural environment. And this can be an opportunity for farmers to work with the wider rural community in partnership, strengthening rural resilience. And as a Scottish Cooperative Party MSP, I want to say I think it is a good step forward to put this new section in with a £10 million support. And the Edelston Water Project, led by the Tweed Forum, which the Minister will know about as well, is a timely example. And I quote from the consultation, "It coordinated a number of partners to develop a restoration strategy to both restore natural habitats and help with the risk of flooding." On the basis of the evidence taken at our committee, I'm also pleased to see agroforestry gaining support with, I quote from the consultation again, an integrated approach to the management where trees and livestock can coexist, as this can bring multiple benefits, which we must always be looking for. Can I make a plea also from Archaeology Scotland briefing that sites should be enhanced and protected in the CAP process as part of our heritage? Elaine Murray addressed the issue of devolution, particularly the benefits of further localism within Scotland rather than between countries of the UK. This would allow more specific solutions to local rural issues, and I would certainly agree with the value of adopting this approach. And finally, to new entrants. The inclusive measures are welcome. However, in the words again of Clydesdale farmer Tom French, the biggest obstacle to new entrants gaining a start in the industry is the availability of land. Without some measures to encourage letting and deter in-hand farming and land grabbers, any new entrant scheme will be doomed to failure. How starkly this reminds us all that getting the details of CAP reform right is only part of the puzzle for rural Scotland, along with a range of other actions. And if we are to have vibrant rural communities where we produce more of our own food while caring for our land for future generations, then the Cabinet Secretary is right. It is fairness, not history, which will count. And we must all work together on this. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call on Richard Lockhead to wind up the debate. Cabinet Secretary, you have 12 minutes.
Thank you. It's been a good and helpful debate, hearing MSPs from across the chamber highlight some of the key issues to their constituents and their parties. I should start by saying that yesterday I had the privilege of attending the Cabinet meeting in Bathgate, where after the Cabinet meeting we had our question and answer session with the public, and then I had the opportunity to visit a local food business, Finlayter's Fine Foods, and that reminded me of how this debate is not just about the primary producers, it's about the whole of the supply chain, it's about the wider impact on the rural and national economy as well, because the farmers and crofters in Scotland produce some of the best raw materials you can get anywhere on the planet that underpins our fantastically successful food and drink industry, as I was able to witness at first hand when I visited Finlayter Fine Foods.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for taking the intervention. On the subject of fine Scottish foods, would he agree with me that venison is one of the finest Scottish foods? And can he clarify the position of deer farmers in Scotland at the moment vis-à-vis subsidy?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, I can clarify that venison is one of Scotland's finest foods, and I'll certainly come back to the wider issue over deer farmers shortly. But in terms of the food industry, that also reminds us that as our farmers and crofters produce for our food and drink industry, then much of our activity clearly has to be guided towards the demands of the market. And our income and our profitability of agriculture in Scotland is very much dependent on being market-focused as well as getting the right support mechanisms in place. And it is a good sign, a healthy sign, that the demand from the marketplace for Scottish produce is on the up, not just in this country, but throughout the whole of the world as well. And we have to really focus many of those debates on that opportunity, as well as the opportunity of getting the right support mechanisms in terms of financial support in place as well. I should also say that I visited a livestock haulier yesterday as well, one of Scotland's biggest livestock hauliers, giving another example of the dependency of other sectors on agriculture. And this is not just a debate about one particular sector. We have the beef sector, we've got the sheep sector, we've got the pig sector, the poultry sector, the dairy sector, and indeed the venison and deer sector, as mentioned by Jamie McGregor as well. And all of these sectors in their own individual ways contribute hugely to the Scottish economy. And this debate is ensuring we've got the right support mechanisms in place in the years going ahead to support that fantastic contribution to Scotland, not just to our tables, but to the wider economy as well. I think, though, we should avoid the scaremongering. I thought it was ironic that Jim Hume said in the one breath that we hope that, or he hopes that the Scottish Government will not use this debate to make any constitutional points. And then, of course, he proceeded to at least lay down 4 scaremongering arguments about what would happen to various sectors if Scotland were to vote to be a normal country in September. I thought that was sheer hypocrisy from Jim Hume, but I guess we just have to get used to that. And I would, of course, make the point that I think the biggest threat, as indeed most of the farmers I speak to, and particularly the food and drink sector I speak to, the biggest threat to their livelihoods and to their future is the idea that the UK may pull Scotland out of Europe in the future. Excluding our industry from £500 million consumers in Europe, that is the biggest threat to our food and drink industry in this country. But we have to say it is a very anxious time for our farmers in Scotland at the moment, our rural communities, with the ongoing discussions over the next Common Agricultural Policy. I have to say, where we are just now in the consultation we have been discussing today does follow a couple of years of very close, detailed work with our stakeholders in this country. And therefore, what you see in the consultation document is not off the top of the heads of Scottish Government officials or my ideas alone. It is, of course, the result of that detailed partnership working with the Scottish industry. And that has also been the subject of very detailed modelling over recent months in the last year or so as well. However, it is a consultation and we're listening very closely to what people say. I have to say, though, I think Rhoda Grant perhaps has been taking part in a different debate over the last couple of years when she says that the changes taking place in the Common Agricultural Policy will disadvantage the Highlands and Islands. Given that is far from the case. Of course, there may well be individual producers within the Highlands and Islands who will see a big reduction in their payments, and I'll come on to the reason for that shortly. But Argyll and Bute, the Western Isles, Highlands and Shetland, of course, will see their payments increase under the shift of the new payment system, where we're moving from historic to area basis. So it's not right to stand up in this chamber and say the reforms will disadvantage the Highlands and Islands for the reasons that he outlined. Yeah.
Liam MacArthur.
Very grateful to the Cabinet Secretary taking a further intervention. The constituency conspicuous by its absence from that list was obviously Orkney, and given the detailed modelling he's been doing with his officials, can he shed any light on the sorts of interventions that can be made in order to support the sort of production that has been characteristic of Orkney over a number of decades?
Cabinet Secretary.
And of course, Liam MacArthur's question gets to the heart of much of this debate, which is we are now going through what is going to be the first massive redistribution of funds across Scottish agriculture as a result of the new Common Agricultural Policy. One final brief intervention.
Grant. Can I just ask the Cabinet Secretary to confirm that the rumours that the €25 amount will decrease are wrong, and will he give the commitment to ensure that this increases along with the Hutton Institute report?
Yeah. Can I ask Rhoda, after a previous contribution, and that contribution, can I ask Rhoda Grant to raise the standard of this debate in terms of referring to rumours in the chamber? We're in the middle of a consultation. We're listening to different views from across all sectors, across all parties, and every part of Scotland. We will listen closely to what people say. We have not taken any decisions on what we will change or not change within the consultation. No doubt there will be changes, and I'll come on to them shortly in some of the areas that people are highlighting, but to talk about rumours in a debate like this, I think just lowers the tone overall. But we're going through a major change with the new Common Agricultural Policy. We're moving from a historic basis of payment to an area basis of payment. Therefore, that's why many producers in Orkney and elsewhere will be calculating using the ready reckoner, which is being used by many farmers in Scotland, which gives an estimate of the likely outcome under one particular scenario. They will see big reductions in their payments. Because the background to this, of course, is that when we had the heritage payments before, in the 1990s, and then, of course, that determined the single farming payment under the most recent reforms, which people got in the 2000s up to the current day. That was based on activity back literally in the 1990s or before. And we're moving from that to breaking the link between payments and production, as agreed by Europe, to the area payments. Therefore, those who do face the prospect of the big reduction in payments are those who benefited from the payments they got before under the 1990s regime or before that. But here we are in 2014, now facing a change from historic payments to area payments. And Europe is not allowing a link between the area payments to production. Therefore, the size of the herds or activity on the farm does not relate directly to the size of the area payment. That is the crux of this debate. It's the major dilemma we have, where we're trying to support activity and support production, but the rules agreed under the Common Agricultural Policy as a condition of getting the budget do not allow that to happen, other than with the limited couple scheme that we have secured for Scotland during negotiations. So that's where we are at the moment. And of course, we have this limited couple scheme. We started off the negotiations with Owen Paterson saying he did not want to use it at all, so it would be 0%. There would be no link whatsoever with production. We moved then to his position of 5% as a apparent concession to Scotland, but obviously because he was going to lose the vote in the Council of Ministers. And then, of course, Europe finally decided that one tier of countries would get 13% of their budget being able to be used for couple payments, and another tier of countries would get 8%. And unfortunately, Owen Paterson, the UK Government, decided we'd be in the 8% category.
Alex Ferguson.
Cabinet Secretary, as I referred to in my contribution, is he able to say whether or not he has taken up offers to discuss an increase in that payment, and if so, does he expect a successful outcome?
And as I said in my opening remarks, we now have the option of increasing the 8% to perhaps around 10% as been discussed with the UK Government, but there are many different conditions attached to that, and we're working with them to iron out these strings attached to having this generous extra 2% for coupled payments in Scotland. I'll keep Parliament updated on that progress. So where we have a situation, please, I really have to move on in my remaining 3 minutes. Therefore, we have a situation where we have a smaller budget for Scotland. We have new entrants coming into the payment system for Scotland. We have mandatory deductions from the pot of money allocated to Scotland in terms of young farmers' money that has to be deducted, and in terms of the National Reserve that has to be deducted as well. Therefore, it follows that there are going to be reductions in payments for many farm businesses against that backdrop throughout Scotland. And what we are trying to do now is to make the area payments as far as possible linked to activity. We can't link to production, but we can link to activity, and that's what we want to do, because we do not want to pay, it's not in Scotland's interest or the interest of the public purse, vital investment in food production and looking after the environment to businesses that are inactive. And that's why it was so important to secure the Scottish clause. Now, whilst Europe is saying that we cannot use a minimum stocking density, because under WTO rules that is linked to production, we are confident there are other ways of tying that Scottish clause into activity in Scotland. The more we can do that, the more we can take payment away from inactive businesses to up the payments for active businesses. Clearly, that's a very important point of this debate. And of course, I should say we should not just talk about livestock when we're talking about the reform of the Common Agricultural Policy. The arable sector, of course, in some cases faces some difficult challenges with the greening proposals, which were largely designed for the monoculture you see in Eastern Europe and not the diverse agriculture we see in Scotland. But nevertheless, at least they're a lot better than where they were a year ago, where they've been really impossible to implement in the Scottish context. But at least we now have a set of greening proposals that can be implemented in the Scottish context. And to answer some of the questions, we're working closely with the arable sector to look at how we can mitigate the impact on the production of malting barley, which is so important to the Scotch whisky industry as well. So, in addressing some of these really important issues, there will be changes to the consultation. I think we can say that fair and square. Clearly, we're in the middle of a consultation. I don't know what changes will be made. We have to go into any changes with our eyes open of the consequences and the knock-on impact on any sector if we help one particular sector. These are very, very difficult dilemmas, very, very difficult circumstances. But the issue of the number of payment regions, which Jim Hume and others raised in this debate, is of course something we're listening to very, very closely. It may be that we divide the grazing into 2 regions or whatever. There's a number of suggestions out there about how to make it more fair and equitable and to protect genuine activity. However, again, we could have a situation where one farm has 3 categories of fields on the one farm. And again, whilst we are genuinely looking at this as an option, it clearly brings a price with it, and we have to make sure we can cope with that in terms of its implementation. But I'm confident if we work closely together with the industry, we'll find a way forward for many of these important issues. 2 quick issues, if I can mention, in the last couple of minutes of my speech. Firstly, Pillar 2, of course, is crucially important in this debate, and many members have mentioned the importance of Pillar 2, and we have protected the less favoured area scheme within that, which is worth between £60 and £65 million a year. Absolutely crucial to the outlying areas of Scotland and those areas where the land is that bit poorer quality, where there's extra challenges in farming and producing food and looking after the environment, and therefore that justified the 9.5% transfer from one pillar of the policy to the other pillars of the policy. I understand the arguments for using the full 15%, and I also got arguments about using 0%, not doing any transfer. I think we achieved a fair compromise. So the final point I really have to make is, of course, this is all underpinned, these decisions, by the size of Scotland's budgets. I don't believe there will be any review that will deliver any results for Scotland in 2016 onwards in terms of the convergence uplift. 2016's after the next UK elections, we're likely to have a new Secretary of State in DEFRA. Hopefully Scotland won't even be bothered listening to what DEFRA have to say, because we'll be an independent country at that point in time, which I'll come on to again as well. And of course, there may be even a referendum to leave Europe by the rest of the UK at that point in time as well, because by the time there's a result of a 2016 review, it will be 2017 or 2018. But can I just say that because Scotland was not a member state in Europe during the recent CAP negotiations, that has cost us a €1 billion uplift because we're not a member state in our own right. That has cost us a £220 million uplift that we should have got, which came to the UK because of Scotland's lower payments, as some kind of concession for not getting the €1 billion. It has cost us 2,500 jobs that have been created in Scotland's rural communities as a result of getting that extra €1 billion that belongs to Scotland between 2014 and 2019. And it's cost us the £500 million that have been added on to Scottish GNP because of the extra 2,500 jobs and the extra €1 billion that have been pumped into farming businesses the length and breadth of Scotland. So I have to say, as I close, Presiding Officer, that I will work with the industry, I will work with all parties to get the best common agricultural policy as we go through this difficult and challenging but very important process for the new policy. But, you know, if Scotland had been an independent country, many of these difficult issues we are wrestling with at the moment would have been a lot easier. With independence, our farmers and our crofters will be wealthier, Scotland will be an even bigger food-producing nation, our rural economy will be prosperous, and we'll have a bright, bright future for Scotland's farmers and crofters. Thank you.
That concludes the debate on the Common Agricultural Policy. The next item of business is consideration of motion number 8832 in the name of Stuart Stevenson on committee substitutes. I call on Stuart Stevenson to move and talk to the motion on behalf of the Standards Procedures and Public Appointments Committee. Mr Stevenson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And before moving to the substance of the motion that's before us, I think it would be right and proper to draw Parliament's attention to the two reports I will be speaking to today, SP Paper 402 and 433, and the role that two of our late members, Brian Adam and Helen Eadie, played in their preparation. My old boss once said that on the day after you leave office, the tide has come in and your footprints have left the beach. But I think these two much-missed members, in making their contribution to what I'm going to be speaking about this afternoon, we should acknowledge their efforts on that behalf. The Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee is recommending some minor changes to standing orders. The first, to which I speak, clarifies that a member of the Public Audit Committee, should they become a minister, they would cease to be a member of that committee. Now, in practice, that's always been the case, but previously there has been some ambiguity in the rules, which we now seek to correct. The second change relates to the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee itself. On occasion, the Standards Committee may have to consider a complaint about a member, but what happens if that member is a member of the Standards Committee and is subject to a complaint? It's possible that the member concerned may not wish to attend committee meetings at which the complaint is being considered. However, the current rules won't allow the member to send a substitute in his or her place. The Standards Committee would have to meet with one fewer member, which could impact on its work. We've agreed as a committee to seek Parliament's approval for an amendment to standing orders so that a member of the Standards Committee can send a substitute in their place if they decide not to attend a meeting because the committee is considering a complaint against them. The new rules will not, however, affect the right of a member of the committee to attend a meeting when they were the subject of a complaint, if they wished to do so. The Parliament is invited to agree that these standing order changes should come into effect on the 3rd February. I have pleasure in moving motion S4M 8822 that stands in my name.
Thank you. The question on this motion will be put at decision time. I now call on Stephen to move 8833 on Presiding Officer and Deputy Presiding Officer elections.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I know this will be a matter of considerable interest to the Presiding Officer and other members. The Standards, Procedure and Public Appointments Committee is today also proposing some changes to the rules on Presiding Officer elections. The Scotland Act places a number of requirements on Parliament in relation to the election of presiding officers, rightly so, given the importance of the role. However, in the first few years of operation, it's become clear that the rules were rather too restrictive and some real operational difficulties have arisen. For example, when our first presiding officer, Sir David Steele, had to undergo an operation, his two deputies had to carry his workload between them. There was no scope to appoint a temporary deputy presiding officer to fill the gap. A different difficulty arose at the start of Session 3, when we had our first experience of minority government. Given the importance of every seat in the parliamentary arithmetic of that session, it took some time for possible candidates for presiding officer to emerge. And yet, the Parliament was required to elect a presiding officer at its first meeting. A procedural fix was devised, and we were able to elect Alec Ferguson on our second meeting day. But it was unsatisfactory, and it's something that could arise again in future. I see Alec Ferguson is volunteering already. The Scotland Act 2012 addressed both these problems. The changes which I am proposing today on behalf of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee will translate the Scotland Act into standing orders. The first change will allow the presiding officer elections to take place at any time within 14 days of the general election, counting from the day after the poll. The oath-taking must be completed first, and no other business can take place until the presiding officer and deputies have been elected, but we are no longer restricted to the first meeting. The committee took the view that some flexibility was desirable. In general, the Parliament will want to elect the presiding officers as soon as possible so that it can get down to business, but that may not always be possible. So the rules we've drafted would allow the elections to take place on the first meeting day or at a later meeting, or indeed for the presiding officer to be elected on one day and the deputies on a subsequent day. The committee took the chance to review all the rules on presiding officer elections. Our conclusion was that they generally worked well, and we did not detect any appetite for significant changes. However, we did agree that the timetable was a little tight. So we're proposing that for both elections, there should be an hour between the close of nominations and the start of voting, rather than 15 minutes at present, a short space for members to reflect on and discuss the nominations before they have to vote. We're also proposing that there should be an hour rather than 15 minutes to submit nominations for deputy presiding officers. The rule changes will allow additional deputies to be appointed. The most likely reason for this is illness, but there could be other reasons. But we've left it to the presiding officer and the Bureau to decide when and for how long an additional deputy is needed, with the safeguard that any proposal must be agreed by the Parliament. The overall political balance of the presiding officer team is also protected by the new rules. As with the previous motion, the Parliament is invited to agree that these standing order changes should come into effect from the 3rd of February. I move motion 8833 that stands in my name.
Thank you, Mr Stevenson. The question on this motion will be put at decision time. The next item of business is consideration of motion number 8866 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme. Any member who wishes to speak against the motion should press the request to speak button now. And I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 8866.
Formally moved.
No member is asked to speak against the motion, therefore I now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 8866 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of business motion 8868 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a Stage 1 timetable for the Disabled Person Parking Scotland Bill. Any member who wishes to speak against the motion, please press the request to speak button now. And I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 8868.
Moved.
No member has asked to speak against the motion, therefore I now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 8868 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of business motion 8869 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a revised Stage 1 timetable for the Procurement Reform Scotland Bill. Any member who wishes to speak against the motion should press the request to speak button now. And I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 8869.
Moved.
No members asked to speak against the motion. I now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 8869 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of two Parliamentary Bureau motions. I would ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 8867 on consideration of the Local Government Finance Scotland Order 2014 and motion number 8870 on committee meetings.
Moved.
The question on these motions will be put at decision time, to which we now come. There are 7 questions to be put as a result of today's business. I would wish to remind members that in relation to the debate on the Common Agricultural Policy, if the amendment in the name of Claire Baker is agreed, the amendment in the name of Alec Ferguson falls. The first question then is amendment number 8857.2 in the name of Claire Baker, which seeks to amend motion number 8857 in the name of Richard Lockhead on the Common Agricultural Policy be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 8857.2 in the name of Claire Baker is as follows. Yes, 35. No, 77. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question is that amendment number 8857.1 in the name of Alex Ferguson, which seeks to amend motion number 8857 in the name of Richard Lockhead on the Common Agricultural Policy be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 8857.1 in the name of Alex Ferguson is as follows. Yes, 50. No, 59. There were 2 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question is that motion number 8857 in the name of Richard Lockhead on the Common Agricultural Policy be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion number 8857 in the name of Richard Lockhead is as follows. Yes, 92. No, 17. There were 2 abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 8832 in the name of Stuart Stevenson on committee substitutes be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 8833 in the name of Stuart Stevenson on presiding officer and deputy presiding officer elections be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 8867 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on the Local Government Finance Scotland Order 2014 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 8870 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on committee meetings be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. We now move to members' business. Members who are leaving the chamber should do so quickly and quietly.